My name is Edmund Marsh, and on the evening I first arrived at the cottage, the rain had only just stopped, and the road glittered with it the way a long sentence glitters when it has finally found its rest. The bus from the town had let me off at a crossroads marked by a wooden post and 3 faded letters, and the driver, an old man with a kind face and a wool cap pulled low, had wished me luck in a voice so soft I almost did not catch it. He waited until I had gathered my 2 suitcases and my satchel and my coat, and then he tipped his cap and pulled away, and the engine of the bus faded down the lane until I could hear only the sea and the wind in the hedges, and a single bell ringing somewhere far off in the hills. I stood for a long while at the crossroads. The west of Ireland has a particular quality of light in the early evening, a soft pewter glow that seems to come not from the sky but from the land itself, as though the fields have been storing the warmth of the day and are now releasing it slowly, the way an old stone wall releases the heat of the sun long after the sun has gone. The lane that ran down toward the village wound between low hedges of fuchsia and bramble, and the leaves were wet, and the air smelled of salt and turf smoke and the green sweetness of new grass. Above the hedges I could see the slate roofs of houses, perhaps a dozen of them, gathered around a little harbor whose water was the color of polished tin. Beyond the harbor lay the open sea, and beyond the sea the great pale dome of the evening sky. I picked up my cases. They were heavier than I remembered. I had packed too many books, as I always do, and I had packed them as though I were preparing for a long winter of solitude, which, in a way, I was. The lane sloped gently downward, and as I walked the air grew softer, and the smell of the sea grew stronger, and from somewhere behind the houses I heard a dog bark once and then fall silent. A few sheep stood in a field to my left, watching me with their patient sideways eyes, and one of them coughed in a small dignified way and then went back to chewing. The cottage I had come to was called Cregmore, which an old letter had told me meant something like the Rock of the Watching. It had belonged to my great-aunt Ellen, whom I had only met 3 times in my life, all of them in childhood, and who had left the cottage to me in a will so brief and so courteous that I had read it twice without quite believing it. She had died in the spring, peacefully, in a hospital bed in the city, and her solicitor had written to me at the end of summer to say that the cottage was mine if I wished to take it, and that if I did not wish to take it, the village would not mind, because the village had always rather liked the cottage and would find a use for it. I had read that letter 3 times. The 3rd time I read it, I had already begun to pack. I had not been happy in the city. I had not been unhappy either, but there is a kind of quiet wearing down that happens to a person who lives too long in rooms that face other rooms, and who walks too long on pavements that face other pavements, and who hears too long the sounds of other people's lives through the thin walls of his own. I was a translator by trade. I worked in French and German and a little Italian, mostly novels, sometimes letters and memoirs and the occasional volume of poetry. My work could be done anywhere there was a desk and a lamp and a quiet hour. The city had ceased to give me quiet hours. The cottage, the solicitor had said, was very quiet indeed. The lane turned, and the cottage came into view. It sat a little apart from the village, on a low rise above the harbor, with a stone wall around a small overgrown garden, and a slate roof darkened by years of weather. The walls were whitewashed, though the paint had thinned in places to show the rough stone beneath, and the door was painted a deep green, the color of moss in the bottom of a well. 2 small windows looked out toward the sea, and a 3rd window, smaller still, looked down toward the village. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, which surprised me, because I had not expected anyone to be there. Then I remembered the letter from a Mrs. Keneally, who had written to say that she would light the fire and air the rooms before I arrived, and would leave a few things in the larder, and would I be so kind as to leave the key under the 3rd flower pot on the left when I went out. because the lock was old and the village did not bother much with locks anyway. I walked up to the door. The key was in my pocket. I stood for a moment with my hand on the latch, and I listened to the sea, which sighed against the rocks below the cottage as though it had been waiting for me, and to the wind which moved through the long grass of the garden, and to my own breath, which was steadier than it had been in a long while. Then I lifted the latch and pushed the door open. The smell of the cottage came out to meet me. It was the smell of turf smoke and beeswax and old paper and a faint cleanness like washed linen drying in a warm room. The fire was low in the hearth but alive, a small heap of red embers under a covering of gray ash, and beside the hearth a basket of fresh turf and a smaller basket of kindling. The floor was flagstone, worn smooth by generations of feet. A round table stood in the middle of the room, covered with a blue and white cloth, and on the table was a loaf of brown bread under a cloth, and a small jar of butter, and a pot of jam, and a kettle that had recently been used. The note lay beside the kettle. I set down my cases and read it. "Welcome to Cregmore, Mr. Marsh," the note said in a round, careful hand. "There is milk in the larder, and a bit of cheese, and some eggs from my own hens. The fire will hold the night if you bank it before bed. If you need anything at all, you will find me at the green door 3 down from the church. I am very sorry for your loss. Your aunt was a good woman and is missed. Welcome home. Anne Keneally." I read the note twice. The phrase that stayed with me was, "Welcome home," which was a strange thing to say to a man who had never lived in the place he was being welcomed to, and yet it did not feel strange to read it. It felt accurate. I set the note down. I looked around the room. It was a small room, but it was beautifully proportioned, with a low ceiling crossed by dark beams and walls that had been freshly whitewashed within the year. A dresser stood against one wall, painted the same deep green as the door, and on its shelves were arranged a set of blue and white plates and a row of cups hanging from little hooks. A wooden settle stood near the fire, with a cushion the color of oatmeal upon it, and a small rocking chair stood opposite, with a folded blanket of gray wool on its seat. A door at the back of the room led, I assumed, to the kitchen proper and the larder, and a narrow staircase rose along the side wall to whatever lay above. The third window, the one looking down toward the village, framed a square of pewter sky and a single chimney with its thin smoke. I took off my coat. I hung it on a peg by the door. I lifted my cases one by one and carried them up the narrow stairs. There were 2 rooms above, both small, both with the same low ceilings and whitewashed walls. The first was a bedroom with a brass bed and a patchwork quilt and a small washstand with a blue jug and basin, and a window that looked out over the sea. The second was a smaller room, more of a study, with a writing desk under the window and a low bookshelf along one wall and a single chair. Both rooms had been swept and aired, and both rooms smelled faintly of beeswax and the salt wind. I stood for a long while at the bedroom window. The sea was darker now, a dim slate color with a long line of paler gray where the horizon met the sky, and the harbor lay below me with its little fleet of fishing boats, perhaps 8 or 9 of them, rocking gently at their moorings. A man in a yellow oilskin was walking along the harbor wall, carrying a coil of rope. A gull stood on a bollard, looking out to sea. A child somewhere was being called in for supper, the call long and musical and unhurried. The smoke from the chimneys of the village drifted west, low along the rooftops, and the first lamps were beginning to glow in the windows. I had not cried in a long time. I did not cry then either, but something inside me unclenched, the way a hand unclenches when it has been holding something heavy for too long, and I felt very tired and very glad and very small. I went back downstairs. I put the kettle on the hook above the fire. I added a fresh sod of turf to the embers and watched the small new flames lick up around it. I cut a slice of the brown bread and spread it with butter and jam. and I sat down on the settle with the slice on a plate and watched the kettle warm. Outside, the wind moved softly through the long grass. Inside, the fire ticked and breathed. I ate the bread. It was the best bread I had ever tasted, though I knew, even as I thought this, that it was not really the bread, but the moment that I was tasting. The kettle began to whisper, and then to sigh, and then to sing a low single note, and I lifted it off the hook and made tea in a brown teapot I found on the dresser, and I poured a cup and added a little milk from the jug Mrs. Keneally had left in the larder. The tea was strong and dark and warm. I drank it slowly. I did not think about anything in particular. I watched the firelight on the flagstones. I listened to the sea. When the cup was empty, I sat for a while longer, and then I rose and banked the fire as Mrs. Conneely had told me to do, raking the embers together and covering them with ash so that they would hold until morning. I lit a candle from a tin on the mantel and took it upstairs with me. I undressed slowly in the cold air of the bedroom and slid under the patchwork quilt, which was heavy and clean and smelled of lavender, and I blew out the candle and lay on my back and listened. I could hear the sea. I could hear the wind. I could hear very faintly the bell I had heard at the crossroads, ringing somewhere far off, perhaps in another village, perhaps on a buoy in the bay. I could hear the small sounds of the cottage settling itself for the night, the tiny creaks of old wood and the occasional soft tick of cooling stone. I could hear my own breath. I could not hear anything else. There were no cars, no voices, no music from other windows, no machinery, no clocks. There was only the night, the sea, and the soft, slow breath of a house that had stood here a very long time and would stand here a very long time more. I closed my eyes. The bed was warm. The dark was deep. I slept. I woke once in the night, briefly, to the sound of rain on the slate roof. It was a soft rain, steady and unhurried, and it sounded like a great many small fingers tapping gently on the slates, asking to be let in. I lay still and listened. The rain went on for perhaps half an hour, and then it eased, and then it stopped, and I heard the eaves still dripping for some time afterward, the slow, regular patter of water finding its way down into the garden. I thought about getting up to see whether the rain had come in at any of the windows, but I was warm and the quilt was heavy and the rain had stopped, and so I let the thought drift away from me, and I slept again. And when I woke the second time it was morning, and the room was full of a pale gray light, and a gull was crying somewhere over the harbor. I lay for a while without moving. The morning in a new place is a particular kind of morning. You have not yet learned the sounds of the house, and so every sound is a question. A creak of wood becomes a small puzzle. The slow drip of water from the eaves becomes a small story. The wind in the chimney becomes a small song. I lay and listened and made small puzzles and small stories and small songs out of the morning. And then I rose. The flagstones were cold under my bare feet. I dressed quickly, in wool trousers and a thick jumper Mrs. Keneally had not provided but which I had wisely brought from the city, and I went down the narrow stairs. The fire had held, just barely, a small red heart of itself still alive beneath the ash. I uncovered it and laid on a few sticks of kindling and a fresh sod of turf, and I sat for a while on the settle, watching the new fire find its courage. When the flames had taken hold, I filled the kettle from the tap in the kitchen, which produced a thin, clear stream of cold water, and I hung it over the fire. The kitchen was small, narrower than the main room, with a stone sink under a window that looked out over the back garden. A little range stood against one wall, though I could see that it had not been used in some time, and a few shelves held an assortment of plates and bowls, and a small army of jars in various shapes and sizes. A door led from the kitchen to a kind of pantry or scullery, where the larder was, and another door led to the garden. I opened the garden door and looked out. The garden of Cregmore was not large, and it was not by any reasonable definition tended. A path of broken flagstones led from the door through a tangle of grass and herbs and small flowering things to a low stone wall, beyond which the land sloped down toward the sea. Inside the wall were two old apple trees, gnarled and gray, and a clump of rosemary, and a patch of mint that had run wild, and a stand of cornflowers and dog daisies, and against the wall a small rambling rose with a few last white blossoms clinging to its canes. The grass was wet from the night's rain. A blackbird hopped along the wall, watched me a moment, and flew away. I stood in the doorway and breathed. The air was washed and cold and smelled of the sea and the wet earth and the rosemary, and somewhere a turf fire was burning in another house, and the smoke of it drifted up the hill, and there was no other sound but the small sounds of the garden and the sea below. I stood there a long time. Then I went back inside, because the kettle was beginning to sing. I made tea. I made toast over the fire, holding the slice on a long brass fork I had found in a drawer, and I spread the toast with butter and the jam Mrs. Keneally had left, which turned out to be blackcurrant, dark and slightly tart. I ate at the round table, looking through the seaward window at the harbor, which the morning had revealed in a fuller light. The boats were a small fleet of working trawlers, painted in faded blues and reds and greens, and a few smaller punts and one currach drawn up on the shingle. A man was bent over a net on the harbor wall, and a woman was walking a black dog along the strand, and a small white cat was sitting on a windowsill of one of the houses, watching everything with the deep patience of cats. The sky was the color of pearl. Far out, where the harbor opened to the sea, a single white sail was moving slowly south. When I had finished eating, I washed the cup and the plate at the kitchen sink, and I dried them on a linen cloth that had been hung neatly on a peg, and I put them away in the dresser. I felt, in a small way, that I had done my first piece of work in the house. The cup and the plate were now where they should be, ready to be used again, and someone, in some future morning, would take them down and use them, and that someone might be me or someone else, and either way the cup and the plate would have done their job and the house would have done its job, and I felt very small and very content. I went out into the garden. I walked the broken path. I touched the rosemary and brought my fingers to my face and breathed in the sharp green smell of it, and I stood at the low wall and looked down at the harbor. The path from the cottage to the village ran along the top of a low cliff, with a wooden gate at one end of the garden that opened onto a stony way down. I unlatched the gate. It swung open with a small, soft squeak, the kind of squeak a gate makes when it has been opened by 10,000 hands over 100 years and is no longer surprised by anything. I went through. The path was narrow and a little slippery from the rain. It wound down the slope between low rocks and tussocks of seagrass, with a few wind-bent thorn bushes leaning over it from one side. As I descended, I could hear the sea more clearly, the long, slow heave of it against the rocks of the bay, and the smaller chuckle of the small waves coming into the harbor. A few yards above the harbor, the path joined a wider lane of crushed shell and stone, and I followed this along the harbor wall until I came into the village. The village was called Cregmore. I had read the name on the wooden post at the crossroads, and on the note from Mrs. Keneally, and on the small painted board that hung above the door of the post office. It was perhaps 30 houses in all, gathered loosely around the harbor and along a single street that climbed up the hill to the church, which stood at the highest point of the village with a small gray tower and a black weather vane in the shape of a fish. The houses were mostly white or pale yellow, with slate roofs, and most of them had small front gardens enclosed by low walls. Many had window boxes, and many of the window boxes were still full of late flowers, geraniums and marigolds, and the last of the petunias. The street was paved with worn cobbles. A few people were about, a woman sweeping a doorstep, a man in a flat cap walking a sheepdog, 2 children with a hoop and a stick, Smoke rose from every chimney. I had a small list of things to do, written on the back of an envelope. I wanted to find the post office and tell them that I was at the cottage, and I wanted to find Mrs. Conneely and thank her, and I wanted to buy a few things to keep me through the next day or two, until I had learned where to find what I needed. I had also, less practically, wanted simply to see the village. I had wanted to walk along the harbor and look at the boats and see whether any of the windows had bread in them or fish or tools. And I had wanted to hear the village sounds, the sounds I would come to know. The post office was the third house from the church. It was painted a soft yellow, with a green door, and a small bell above the door that rang when I went in. The woman at the counter was perhaps 60, with very white hair tied back in a bun, and very bright blue eyes, and a green knitted cardigan that had been mended carefully under one arm. She looked up when I came in, and her face changed in the small particular way that faces change when they recognize, without quite knowing why, that they are looking at someone they have been expecting. "You'll be Mr. Marsh," she said. "I am," I said. "Ina said you were coming," she said. "She said you came up on the evening bus. Did you sleep well?" "Very well," I said. "That's a good start," she said. She set down her pen and folded her hands and considered me with great gentle interest. "I am Bridget Walsh. I keep the post office and the shop and a few other small things. If you need stamps or flour or a paper or to send a telegram or any small thing, you come to me. If you need a doctor or a vet, you must go up the road. But for most things I can manage you well enough," she smiled. "Your aunt was very dear to me. I miss her every day." "I am sorry," I said. "Don't be sorry," she said. "She had a good life and a good death, and she is missed, and that is the right shape of things." She paused. "I have a letter for you," she said, and she reached behind her and brought down a small white envelope from a row of pigeonholes. "It came yesterday. I thought it would when Amy said you were coming. I took the envelope. It was from my publisher in the city, forwarding on a manuscript I had been expecting. A French novel about a man who returns to the village of his childhood and finds it altered and unaltered in equal measure. I had agreed to translate it. I had thought, when I agreed, that it would be a useful book to be working on at Carrick Fair. I thought so again now. "Thank you," I said. "I'll keep your letters here for you," Bridget said, "until you tell me otherwise. Most people in the village have me hold their post. It is easier than trekking out to the houses, and it gives them a reason to come into the shop." She smiled again. "What else can I do for you this morning?" I told her what I needed. I needed bread, though I had bread, and I needed milk, and I needed a few eggs, though I had eggs, and I needed coffee, because Mrs. Conneely had not left coffee, and I needed a small notebook if she had one. Bridget listened, nodding gently, and then she moved around the counter and through the small shop and gathered what I needed, item by item, and named the price of each as she put it in a brown paper bag. I paid. She gave me back a small handful of change, which I dropped into my pocket. "You'll meet everyone in time," she said as she handed me the bag. "Don't trouble yourself to remember names yet. They'll come. The village is small, and we all know one another, and we'll know you too. Ine will look in on you tonight if you don't mind. She wanted to see that you were properly settled." "I would be glad to see her," I said. "Good," said Bridget. "Welcome to Cregmore, Mr. Marsh." I went out into the street with my brown paper bag. The bell rang behind me. The air was a little brighter than it had been when I went in, the pearl giving way to a paler silver, and a thin, warm sunlight was breaking through the cloud and laying itself in long, pale bars along the cobbles. I walked down the street toward the harbor. I passed a baker's shop, which I noted, and a small pub, which I also noted, and a shop selling wool and knitting things, and a smithy whose door stood open, and from which came a small, steady tapping. At the harbor I stopped and stood on the wall and watched a man unload a basket of fish from a punt. The man saw me and nodded. "Morning," he said. Morning, I said. He was perhaps 40, with red hair going gray, and a face weathered to the color of old leather. He had a quiet, attentive manner that I would come to recognize as the manner of fishermen, who are accustomed to listening to small changes in the sea and the wind, and who therefore listen to people in the same way. "You'll be at Carrickfair," he said. "I am," I said. "Ellen's nephew." "Yes." He nodded slowly. "She was a fine woman," he said. "She gave me a book once about birds. I still have it." He hefted the basket onto the harbor wall. "I'm Padraig," he said. "Padraig Doyle. I take the post boat across to the islands twice a week, and I fish the rest of the time. If you ever want to see the islands, I'll take you across one day." "I would like that," I said. "Settle in first," he said. "There's no hurry." He looked out at the sea, the kind of long, unhurried look that I would come to think of as the village's chief gesture. "There's never a hurry here," he said. "It's the chief thing about the place." I stood with him a while. We did not speak. A small wind moved over the harbor and ruffled the water. The gull on the bollard rearranged itself. After a while, I said goodbye and walked back up the lane to the cottage with my brown paper bag of small, useful things, and the sun came out properly as I climbed the path, and the wet stones of the garden wall shone, and the rosemary smelled stronger than ever. I let myself into the cottage. I unpacked the bag onto the dresser. I made another cup of tea. I sat at the round table and opened my new notebook and wrote the date at the top of the first page, and then, after a while, I wrote, "Cregmore, Day 1. I sat for a while longer. I added, "I have slept very well." I closed the notebook. The fire was burning low and steady. The cottage was very still. Outside, the gulls cried, and the sea murmured, and the wind moved through the long grass of the garden, and the day, which had only just begun, lay before me like a long white road. In the afternoon, I unpacked my books. I had brought too many of them, as I have said, but in the cottage they did not seem too many. The small bookshelf in the upstairs study held perhaps a third of what I had brought, and the rest I arranged in 2 careful rows along the dresser shelf downstairs and in a small stack on the floor by the settle. Even so, the cottage absorbed them without difficulty, as old houses absorb books, taking them into their walls the way a slow river takes in tributaries. There was a particular pleasure in unpacking the books. Each one was a small reunion. Here was the Tolstoy I had bought as a student and had read in every flat I had lived in since. Here was a thin volume of Edward Thomas's poems, which had been a gift from a friend a long time ago. Here was a Flaubert I had translated, my own translation, with the proofs still tucked into the back. Here was a French dictionary so old that its spine had been mended 3 times. I set each one on its shelf with a small ceremony of recognition, and I had the strange and pleasant feeling that the cottage was being introduced to a long line of old friends, and that it was greeting them politely, and that they were settling themselves in well. When I had finished, I went up to the study. I sat at the desk under the window. The desk was small but solid, made of some dark wood I did not recognize, with 2 shallow drawers and a leather inset on its surface that was much worn. I had brought my typewriter, a small portable affair that had served me through 10 years of work, and I set it on the desk and opened it and looked at it for a long time. I had not yet decided when I would begin work. The French novel could wait a week. It could wait 2 weeks. I had told my editor that I would deliver the translation by the end of February, and it was only the middle of September, and the book was not long. I had time. I closed the typewriter again and went back downstairs. The afternoon passed in a way that I would come to know well. I made another pot of tea. I sat by the fire and read for a while. I went into the garden and pulled a few weeds from around the rosemary, and I cut a sprig of it and brought it into the kitchen and laid it on the windowsill. I walked to the back of the garden and stood on a stone and looked down at the sea, which was very blue now in the late sun, with white edges where the waves broke on the rocks. I went back inside and laid out a few of my papers on the round table and read through them, and I made some notes in my new notebook. I drank a cup of coffee. I lit a candle, though it was not yet dark, because I had bought candles in the shop and I wanted to see one of them burning in the cottage, just to know what that looked like. In the early evening, there was a knock at the door. I knew, without quite knowing how I knew, that this would be Mrs. Keneally. I went to the door and opened it, and there she was, a small woman of perhaps 70, with white hair tucked under a brown shawl, and a round, kind face, and a basket on her arm. She was smiling. "Good evening, Mr. Marsh," she said. "Good evening, Mrs. Connolly," I said. "Please come in. I will only stay a moment," she said. "I wanted to see that you had everything you needed and that the fire had held." She came in and looked around the room with the small, careful glance of a person who has seen the room 1,000 times and is checking whether it has changed. It had not, of course. She nodded. "It looks well," she said. "It always looks well." "Thank you for everything," I said. "The bread, the fire, the note, everything. It was no trouble," she said. "Your aunt was my friend. I wanted to do something for her, and the only thing I could do was to make her house ready for you. And so I did it." She set the basket on the table. "I have brought you a few things, some scones for the morning, and a bit of bacon, and a jar of my own marmalade, and a few candles. You will run through candles quickly here. Everyone does." She paused. "Did you sleep? Very well. That is the cottage," she said. "It is a good sleeping house. It always has been. The walls are thick, and the bed is good, and the sea sings you down." I asked her to sit, and she sat for a moment on the settle, very upright, with her hands folded in her lap. I made her a cup of tea. She accepted it with thanks. She drank it slowly, with the small reverent attention that older people in this part of the country give to tea, and she looked at the fire, and at the room, and at me, in turn. With the same calm, interested gaze, she asked me about my journey. She asked me whether I had eaten. She asked me whether I had work to do. I told her about the French novel. She nodded. "Your aunt translated a book once," she said. "Did you know that?" I did not know that. It was a long time ago. From the Italian. A book of letters. She showed it to me. I could not read the Italian, of course, but I read her English of it, and it was lovely. She had a fine ear for the rhythm of a sentence. She read her own translation aloud to me one winter, sitting where you are sitting now, and the snow was coming down outside, and the fire was high, and I have always remembered it. "I did not know," I said. "There are many things you will not know about her," Ina said gently, "and there are many things you will come to know. That is the gift of a house. It tells you slowly. You should not look in any one place very hard. You should just live here, and the house will tell you what it wants you to know." I did not know how to answer that, so I did not answer it. We sat for a while in a comfortable silence. The fire shifted, settled, sighed. Outside, the wind was rising again, and I could hear it moving through the long grass and around the corners of the cottage. "There will be rain tonight," Anna said. "A proper rain. Hours of it. You will hear it on the roof, and you will think it is the world ending, but it will only be the rain." She smiled. "It is one of the pleasures of the cottage. You will see." She finished her tea. She stood, smoothing her skirt. She put on her shawl. At the door she turned and said, "If you have need of anything, come to the green door 3 down from the church, or send a note with anyone going that way. We are all of us close here. You are not alone, you understand. You are not a stranger." She looked at me with her round, kind face. "Welcome home, Mr. Marsh," she said again, and this time the phrase did not strike me as strange at all, but as the natural and correct thing for her to say. Then she was gone, and the door closed behind her, and the cottage held its small silence around me again. I added another sod to the fire. I sat down. I read for a while. The rain began about an hour after dark. I had not yet eaten supper. I had been reading by the fire, with the candle on the table and the lamp on the dresser, and the wind had been rising, and the long grass in the garden had been moving harder, and I had been hearing, as a low background, the deepening voice of the sea. Then, all at once, the rain came. It came in a great soft rush, like a long sigh, and it struck the slate roof and ran down the eaves and filled the gutters, and the wind drove some of it against the seaward window, where it ran in long quivering rivulets down the glass. It was, as Ina had said, a proper rain. It was the sort of rain that has been waiting for a long time and has finally arrived. I rose. I went into the kitchen. I put a small pan of milk on a corner of the fire, and I set out 2 slices of bread and a piece of the cheese from the larder, and a bit of the bacon Mrs. Conley had brought, and I cut an apple into pieces. When the milk was warm, I poured it into a mug and added a spoonful of honey. I brought all of this back to the round table and ate slowly, listening to the rain. It is one of the great quiet pleasures of life to eat a simple meal indoors while a great rain falls outside. The walls hold off the rain. The fire warms the room. The food is plain and good. The lamps cast their soft circles. The world outside is being washed, and the world inside is being kept dry, and one has done nothing to deserve the contrast, and yet one is given it. I sat at the round table, and I ate my bread and cheese and bacon and apple, and I drank my warm milk with honey, and I listened to the rain. And I was, I think, completely happy in that small and ordinary way that does not look like happiness but is. When I had eaten, I cleared the table. I washed the plate and the mug at the kitchen sink. The rain was still coming down hard. The wind was beginning to push at the corners of the house, and the chimney was singing in a low note, and the candle on the table flickered slightly with the draught. I added another sod to the fire and watched it catch. I drew the rocking chair closer to the hearth. I picked up the book I had been reading, an old English novel I had read 3 times before but liked to come back to, and I sat down with it on my lap. I did not read much. The rain was too pleasant to ignore. I sat for a long while just listening. The book closed on my knee, the fire low and warm. The cat from the village, the small white one, did not appear at the cottage, of course, because the cat from the village did not know me yet and would not appear for several days. But I thought of it, sitting on its windowsill, and I thought of the man with the red hair, Patrick, and of his fishing boat tied up at the harbor, and of Bridget Walsh in the post office, and of Mrs. Keneally in her green-doored house 3 down from the church. I thought of all of them sitting beside their own fires, listening to the same rain, and I felt that I was, in some way I could not quite articulate, sitting with them. There is a thing that happens in a small village where every house is hearing the same rain at the same time, and it is a kind of company even when one is alone. I sat there until the fire grew low again. The rain was easing by then. The wind had quieted. I rose, banked the fire, lit a candle, and went up to bed. I slept that night as deeply as I have ever slept. The rain whispered me down, and the wind sang me down, and the cottage held me, and I went under into a sleep so soft and so full and so complete that I had the sense briefly just before I lost myself of being held in the great hand of the night. When I woke in the morning, the rain had stopped, and the sky was the color of an oyster shell, and a low mist lay along the harbor, and I could hear the slow drip of the eaves, and I lay for a long while just listening. The first week at Cregmore passed slowly. This is not a complaint. I had come here to let things pass slowly. In the city, time had moved in a particular nervous way, made of little segments of train rides and meetings and lunches and editorial deadlines, and one had to lay all of one's segments down end to end and walk along them carefully like a man crossing a stream on stepping stones. At Cregmore, time moved more like the sea, It came in, it went out, it lifted things and let them down again, and one was not required to count it. In the morning I made a fire. This was, in the first week, the act around which my days arranged themselves. I had not made fires in any consistent way before. I had had a small gas fire in my flat in the city, which I had lit by turning a knob and pressing a button, and I had not given it any further thought. The fire at Cregmore was a different matter. It had to be lit, fed, banked, watched, encouraged, and respected. It had its moods. Some mornings it took at once, the kindling catching with a single match, the turf settling into a slow red glow within minutes. Other mornings it sulked, it would not catch. The kindling smoldered and went out. The turf refused to take. I had to coax it. I had to lay a few twists of newspaper and a longer arrangement of kindling and try again, and on the worst mornings I went out to the woodshed at the back of the garden and split a few dry sticks of pine to encourage it. I did not mind the worst mornings. I came to enjoy them. There is a thing that happens to a person who fails at lighting a fire 3 times in a row and on the 4th try succeeds. A small, bright satisfaction warms the chest, and one stands and watches the new flames take hold with a feeling close to pride, though it is too small to be called pride. It is the recognition that one has worked alongside a thing rather than commanded it, and that the thing has answered. In the afternoons of the first week I walked. On different days to the harbor and along the shore to the south, and to the harbor and along the shore to the north, and up the lane behind the village to the small church, and beyond the church into the low hills where the sheep were. I had brought a pair of stout walking shoes from the city. I broke them in over the course of the week. I walked at a pace that the city would not have recognized as walking, the kind of pace at which one stops to look at things, and to listen to things, and to feel the wind on one's face, and to watch a single gull lift off from a fence post and settle on another fence post 20 yards on. On the 3rd day I walked north along the shore. The path ran along the top of a low cliff, between a hedge of fuchsia and the open sea, and below the cliff was a long beach of pale sand. I went down to the beach by way of a narrow set of stone steps cut into the cliff face, and I walked along the wet, hard sand for perhaps 2 miles. The wind was at my back. The sea was a quiet, steady gray. I picked up a few shells. I picked up a small, flat stone, white with a black line through it, and I put it in my pocket. I would, by the end of October, have a row of such stones on the windowsill of the upstairs study. On the 5th day I walked up to the church. The church was small and very old, with thick walls and small, deep windows, and a slate roof darkened by the centuries. The door was unlocked. I went in. The inside was dim and cool, and smelled of stone and old wood, and a faint trace of candle wax. The pews were of dark wood, worn smooth in the manner of much-used things. The altar was simple. A single candle was burning in a brass holder near the door, and there was a small jar of fresh wild flowers on a window ledge. I sat down in one of the back pews. I did not pray. I am not a man given to praying, but I sat for a while in the cool dimness and listened to the silence. And the silence of an old church is a different silence from the silence of an old house, deeper and rounder, a silence that has been kept on purpose by many generations. I thought, sitting there, of my aunt. I had only the dimmest memories of her. I remembered a tall, thin woman with gray hair pinned up severely, and a kind, clear gaze, and a habit of holding her teacup with both hands as though she were warming them against it. I remembered her giving me a book once, in childhood, the title of which I had forgotten. I remembered that she had laughed easily and not loudly. I remembered very little else, and yet I had come on her invitation to live in her house, and I had inherited her chairs and her plates and her view of the sea, and somewhere in the cottage I knew were her own books and her own papers and her own translations, which I had not yet sorted through. The thought of her was a soft thought. I did not mourn her, exactly, because I had not known her well enough to mourn, but I felt grateful. I felt that I owed her a debt I would never be able to repay, and that I had been given a strange and unearned grace, and that the best I could do with this grace was to live well in the house she had given me. I left the church after a while. The afternoon was clear and bright. A few sheep watched me from a low wall as I came down the lane, and one of them gave a small, dignified bleat, perhaps in greeting, or perhaps about some other matter entirely. I walked back through the village and stopped at the baker's. The baker's shop was very small. Its window was filled with loaves of brown bread, round and flat, and small white loaves, and a tray of scones, and a few buns dusted with sugar. A bell rang as I went in. The smell inside was the smell that all good bakers' shops have, the warm, dense smell of bread and yeast and a little wood smoke from the oven, and it wrapped itself around me as soon as the door closed. A man stood behind the counter, a tall, thin man of perhaps 50, with sandy hair gone mostly gray and large hands and a flour-streaked apron. He looked up. He smiled the small, slow, careful smile of a man who has been baking since before dawn. "You'll be Mr. Marsh," he said. The whole village seemed to know my name. I had ceased to be surprised by this. "I am," I said. "I am Niall Burke," he said. "I have been wondering when you would come in." He set down a wooden paddle and dusted his hands on the apron. "What can I do for you this afternoon?" "A loaf of brown bread," I said. "And one of those buns, if you please." "With the sugar," he said. "Yes, they are good today. They are good every day, but they are particularly good today because the butter for them came in fresh this morning, and the sugar happens to be the kind I like." He smiled again. He selected a loaf and a bun and wrapped them and named the price, and I paid. As he handed me the parcel, he said, "Your aunt used to come in every Wednesday for the brown bread and on Fridays for the scones. I have been baking her bread for 16 years. Did you make the bread Mrs. Keneally left for me?" I asked. "I did," he said. "Heine told me you were coming. I made it the night before. I am glad you liked it." "It was wonderful," I said. He looked pleased. "Bread should be wonderful," he said. "It does not always live up to its purpose, but when it does, it is one of the best things in the world." He nodded. "Come in any morning before noon. I am here every day except Sunday." I went out with my parcel. I walked down to the harbor. Padraig Doyle was sitting on a coil of rope on the harbor wall, mending a net. He saw me and waved. I went over. "Settled in?" he said. "Settling," I said. He nodded. "Want to come across to the islands next Tuesday? I am taking the post over." He squinted at the sky. "Should be a fine day. I'll have you back before evening." "I would like that very much," I said. "Good," he said. He went back to his net. I stood and watched him for a while. He worked with great economy of motion, his fingers moving among the cords in a pattern I could not follow but which had clearly been long since memorized by his hands. After a while I said goodbye, and I climbed back up the lane to the cottage with my parcel of bread. That evening I ate the bun with my tea, while the fire burned high and the wind moved softly outside. The bun was, as Niall had said, particularly good. I sat at the round table and ate it slowly and read another chapter of my old English novel. And the candle burned, and the sea murmured, and the day grew dim, and the sky outside the window slowly turned from silver to pewter to the deep blue of dusk, and at last to black, with a small handful of stars showing here and there between drifts of cloud. I had been at Carrickfair for 4 days. I went up to bed thinking that I would begin work on the French novel the next morning, but I did not. I began it the morning after that, which was a Sunday, and that turned out to be a good day to begin. On the Sunday, I sat down at the desk in the upstairs study and opened my typewriter and laid out the French novel beside it. The book was called La Maison Tranquille, which I had been turning over and over in my head, trying to find the right English for. The quiet house was the obvious answer, but obviousness is not always the same as rightness, and I was not yet sure. La Maison Tranquille was the story of a man named Henri who returns to his late mother's house in a small village in the Lot, and who finds the house both as he remembers it and not at all as he remembers it, and who spends a long, slow autumn coming to terms with this. It was a quiet book. It was not a book that announced itself. It was the kind of book that a translator either loves at once or never loves, and I had loved it from the first paragraph. The first paragraph began, La maison m'attendait. I had been thinking about that sentence on and off for 2 months. The literal English was, the house was waiting for me, which was correct and dull. The book deserved better than correct and dull. I sat for a long while at the desk that Sunday morning, watching the harbor through the window, with the first sentence written on the top of a sheet of paper and then crossed out, and rewritten and crossed out, and rewritten again. The seagulls cried. The sea murmured. The wind moved softly. At last I wrote, the house was there, waiting. I sat back. I read it aloud, I read it aloud again. I left it. It was not yet right, but it was no longer wrong, and I knew that with a few weeks of living with it I would find the form that suited the book. I went on. I worked for 3 hours that morning. I worked with the slow, quiet rhythm that comes when one has not been hurried into beginning, and when the room is right, and when there is nothing pressing one to stop. The typewriter clicked. The keys made their small, companionable sound. The carriage returned with its soft, slow clang. Outside, the village went about its Sunday in the way that villages on a Sunday go about their day. A few footsteps on the cobbles, a few voices, a single peal of the church bell at 10:30, and then silence again. I worked until the sun came round to the south window of the study, and then I stopped because I had reached a good stopping place, and because I had learned long ago that the best moment to stop work is the moment one has reached a good stopping place, and not 5 minutes after. I went downstairs. I made myself a simple lunch of bread and cheese and a few slices of apple. I ate at the round table and read the letter Bridget had given me from my publisher, which I had not yet read. It was very short. It hoped I was well, and asked when I expected the translation to be delivered, and offered me, in a careful afterthought, another book to translate after this one if I wished. I read the letter twice. I would answer it tomorrow. In the afternoon I went out. I walked south along the shore for the first time. The path on the south side of the harbor was different from the path on the north. It ran lower, closer to the sea, and it was rockier and rougher. The cliffs on the south side were higher, and the wind, when it came off the sea, came harder. I walked perhaps a mile along this path until I came to a small cove that the village called Carrick Bay. The cove was protected on 3 sides by high rocks, and in its center was a small crescent of fine gray sand, and at the back of the cove, half hidden by gorse, was the ruin of a tiny stone building, perhaps a fisherman's hut from another century. I sat on a rock in the cove for a long time. I watched the small waves come in. The sea was very clear in the shallow water near the sand, a pale green over the white pebbles, and a small crab was working its way along the edge of a tide pool, lifting and replacing each leg with great deliberate care. I thought, sitting there, about what I had come to do. I had come to live for a year, or perhaps longer, in a place I did not know. I had come to translate a book that I loved. I had come to walk, to read, to make fires, to drink tea, to learn the names of the village people, and the names of the birds, and the names of the rocks, and to be quiet. I had not come to be happy, exactly, because happiness is not a thing one comes to a place for. But I had come to be quiet, and I had thought that quietness, kept long enough, and respected enough might in time produce something that looked very much like happiness, or that might not look like anything in particular, but would feel, from the inside, like enough. I rose after a while. I walked back along the path. The wind was at my face this time, and the salt blew into my hair, and I licked my lips and tasted the salt and was happy in the small and quiet way I had come to be happy. I climbed up the path to the lane and walked through the village and up the hill to the cottage. The cat from the village was sitting on the wall of the garden. The small white cat. I stopped at the gate and looked at her, and she looked at me with green eyes, and she did not move. I came slowly through the gate. She did not move. I came up to the wall and sat down beside her, and after a moment, with great calm consideration, she stood up and stepped delicately onto my lap and sat down again, as though she had been considering my fitness for this purpose for some days and had at last concluded in my favor. I sat very still. I did not stroke her. I had learned somewhere, long ago, that one does not stroke a cat the first time the cat has agreed to sit upon one. One waits, the cat will indicate, in time, whether stroking is wanted, and one acts accordingly. I waited. After perhaps 5 minutes, the cat began to purr. The purr was a small, steady rumble, like the distant working of an engine, and it vibrated through the fabric of my trousers and into my legs and up into my chest, and I felt that I had been honored. After another minute she rose, stepped off my lap, jumped down from the wall, and disappeared through a gap in the hedge into the garden of the neighboring cottage. I sat for a while longer alone. I rose. I went inside. That evening I made a stew. I had bought a few small potatoes and a carrot and an onion from Bridget the day before, and I had a few pieces of the bacon Mrs. Keneally had brought, and I had some thyme growing in the kitchen window in a small clay pot Ian had thoughtfully provided. I chopped the onion and softened it in a heavy iron pot over the fire. I added the bacon, I added the potatoes and the carrot, peeled and roughly cut. I poured in a cup of water and a cup of milk and a spoonful of flour. I added thyme and salt and pepper and a bay leaf I found in a jar on the dresser. I put the lid on the pot and hung it over the fire on the long hook that came down from the chimney, and I let it cook. The smell of it filled the cottage slowly. It was a humble smell, a country smell. The smell that the cottage had probably smelled 1,000 times in its long life, and there was something in the rightness of this that made me very glad. While the stew cooked, I read by the fire. I read the Edward Thomas. I read a few of his poems aloud, which I sometimes do when I am alone and want to remember what poems are for. The poems sounded right in the cottage. They sounded better in the cottage than they had ever sounded in the city. They were poems about quiet country places and small, slow weathers and the small, slow people who live among them, and the cottage knew them and welcomed them and made them feel at home. I ate the stew at the round table. I had made enough for 3 meals, and I would eat the rest over the next 2 days, but on that first night I had a bowl of it with a slice of brown bread to soak up the broth, and I ate slowly, with great satisfaction. The stew was not a remarkable stew. It was, in fact, an entirely ordinary stew. But it was the first thing I had made for myself in the cottage, and that made it in its way remarkable to me, and I ate it with the small particular pleasure of a person who has in a small particular way fed himself. After supper, I sat by the fire with my mug of tea and watched the flames. The wind was up. The fire shifted in the draught. The cottage breathed. Somewhere in the village, a fiddle began to play, very faintly, and I listened. I could not make out the tune. It came and went on the wind, a few notes at a time. Then it stopped. Then it began again, and this time I caught the melody. A slow air, very old, very sad, and not sad at all, the way the old airs are. The fiddle played for perhaps 20 minutes, with long pauses between tunes, and then it stopped again and did not begin once more. I sat for a long while with my empty mug, listening to the silence that followed. and I went to bed late and slept well. The weeks went on. I will not record them day by day, because the days began very early to resemble one another in the most peaceful possible way. And to record them day by day would be to give the wrong impression, since each day was different in small particulars but the same in the way that the days of a country autumn are the same. A single, long, slow piece of music played out in many small variations. In the mornings, I made the fire, and made my breakfast, and read for an hour, and then went up to the study and worked on La Maison Tranquille. I worked for 3 hours, sometimes 4. I had set myself the task of 2 pages a day, and I usually did them, though some days I did only 1 and other days I did 3. The book grew slowly. I came to know Henri very well. He became, in some way I could not quite articulate, a kind of companion in the upstairs study, a person whose habits I learned, and whose hesitations I anticipated, and whose silences I respected. There is a particular intimacy that develops between a translator and an author, especially when the author is dead, as the author of La Maison Tranquille was. The author had been a woman named Cécile Boucher, who had died in 1987 in the Lot. She had written 4 novels, of which La Maison Tranquille was the 3rd and most loved. I had her photograph from the back of the French edition, a small black and white image of a woman with short gray hair and a slight smile, propped up on my desk against a stone I had brought up from the beach. I felt that she was a presence in the room. I did not feel that she watched me. I felt that she sat beside me, and that we were working together on something we both cared about, and that she trusted me. In the late mornings, when I had finished my pages, I went downstairs and made another pot of tea and ate a piece of bread, and then I went out. I had begun to take the same walk most days, down through the village to the harbor, along the harbor wall, sometimes a little way up the north path, then back through the village and home. I stopped at the post office. I stopped at the baker's. Sometimes I stopped at the smithy and watched the blacksmith, whose name was Sean, work on a hinge or a horseshoe or whatever small piece of iron was in his fire that day. He worked silently for the most part, with the patient, regular tapping of someone who knew his trade so well that his hands could be left to it while his mind was elsewhere. He would nod to me when I came in, and nod again when I left, and once or twice he gave me a small thing he had made and did not need, a hook or a small iron stand, and he would not take any money for it. In the afternoons I worked in the garden. I had decided that I would, before the winter, put the garden into some better order, not in any ambitious way, just enough to feel that I had taken it in hand. I cleared the path of grass. I cut back the worst of the brambles along the wall. I pruned the apple trees, which had not been properly pruned in some years, and I gathered the windfalls and the few remaining apples on the branches. I made a small heap of cut grass and brambles and burned them in a tidy fire at the back of the garden, where the wind would carry the smoke out to sea. I had not done much gardening in my life, but the work suited me. It was the kind of work that lets the mind drift, and that takes the body to a useful weariness by the end of the day, and that fills the senses with the smells of earth and rosemary and burning wood. The cat from the village began to come to the cottage. Her name, I learned from Bridget, was Tess. She was 9 years old, and she belonged to no one in particular. She lived in a different house every few weeks by her own decision, and the village accepted this arrangement. She had begun to live, in part, at Cregmore. She would appear in the garden in the early afternoons. She would sit on the wall and watch me work. Sometimes she would jump down and walk a little way along the path with me, just behind my heel, and then she would lose interest and go and lie in a patch of sun on the flagstones. I did not feed her, on principle, because she was not my cat, but she sat on my lap in the evenings when I sat by the fire, and she slept once or twice on the foot of my bed when I had left the upstairs window open. She was a peaceful presence. She did not require much. She did not ask for much. I came to like her very much indeed. On a Tuesday in early October, I went with Patrick to the islands. We left at 8 in the morning, when the harbor was still in shadow and the sea was very calm. Patrick's boat was a small wooden punt with a small inboard engine and a tarpaulin over the post sack. He helped me aboard, and we set out across the bay in a long, slow curve, the engine ticking, the wake spreading behind us in a pale white V. The water was a deep glassy green close in, and a paler gray-blue further out, and the islands lay ahead of us, 3 of them, low dark shapes against the lighter horizon. We went first to the nearest island, which was called Inisheene. We tied up at a small concrete pier. Padraig handed the post sack to a man waiting there, who took it without speaking, gave a small nod, and walked away up a stony path. We stayed for perhaps a quarter of an hour. I walked a little way up from the pier and looked around. The island was bare and beautiful. A few low whitewashed houses stood scattered over a sloping hill of green pasture, with stone walls dividing the land into small fields, and a few dozen sheep wandering among them. A church stood at the top of the hill, smaller and older than the church at Cregmore. A few children were playing in front of one of the houses. They saw me and stopped and looked at me with frank curiosity, and I waved, and they waved back and went on playing. We left Inisheene and crossed to the second island, which Padraig called Inishbeg. This was a smaller place, with perhaps 4 or 5 houses, and a single beach of white sand on its eastern side, and a small lighthouse at its northern end. Padraig handed off the post here too, to an old man who came down the path to meet us. The old man knew Padraig well. They spoke for a few minutes about a relative who was ill, and about the price of feed, and about the weather, which the old man said would turn before the week was out, and which Padraig agreed would turn before the week was out, though they did not say what they meant by turn. I walked a little way along the beach. The sand was very fine and very white, and the water that came up over it was so clear that I could see, in 3 feet of it, the small pebbles on the bottom and the shadow of a single seabird flying overhead. We left Inishbeg and crossed to the third island, the farthest out, which Patrick called Inishari. This was a long, thin island, low and gray, with no houses at all that I could see, only a single stone hut at the far end, and a few sheep wandering the slopes. Padraig did not stop here, but circled the island slowly and let me look. He told me that the island had been inhabited until about 1920, when the last family had moved to the mainland. He told me that the stone hut had been a fisherman's shelter in the old days. He told me, in the way that men of his region tell things, slowly and without emphasis, that his grandfather had been born on Inishari, and that as a young man Padraig himself had once spent a summer there, alone, looking after a small flock of sheep. He had been 17. He had lived in the stone hut. He had read every book his mother had given him 3 times, and at the end of the summer when the boat came to bring him home, he had cried because he had not wanted to leave. I asked him whether he ever went back. Sometimes, he said. Not often. It is a sad place to go alone now. There is no one there. We turned and made our way back across the open water toward the mainland. The wind had risen a little, and the boat slapped and bounced over small waves, and I sat in the bow with my coat collar up and my hand on the gunwale, and I felt the cold spray on my face, and I was very glad to be there. Padraig sat in the stern with his hand on the tiller and his eyes on the sea. He did not speak much. When he did speak, it was about the islands, or about the weather, or about a particular school of mackerel he had seen the week before, or about the way the seabirds were behaving, which he could read like a book. We came back into Cregmore harbor in the early afternoon. The harbor was quiet. Padraig tied up the boat and refused, as I had expected, to take any money for the trip. He said only, "Come again when you like. It is good to have someone in the bow." Then he went off home, walking up the lane with his hands in his pockets, and I went up to the cottage. I made a pot of strong tea. I sat by the fire. Tess came in through the door I had left open and sat on my lap. I read by the fire for a while, And then I rose and made supper, and the day moved on toward evening in its quiet way. And at the end of the evening I sat at the round table and wrote in my notebook a few notes about the islands, and I went to bed and slept very well indeed. The weather turned, as Padrig and the old man on Inishbeg had said it would. The change came on a Thursday. The morning had been still, the sea like a polished plate, and I had walked along the harbor as usual. By the time I climbed back up to the cottage, the wind was rising. By the time I had eaten my lunch, a thin gray mist was moving in along the bay, low to the water, dimming the islands until they were only suggestions. By the time I sat down at my desk in the afternoon, the rain had begun. It was, in the manner of West Coast rain, both serious and gentle. It did not lash. It did not sweep. It came down steadily in long, fine threads, very straight, very persistent, the kind of rain that has nowhere to be but here and now, and seems prepared to stay for the better part of a day. The wind drove it against the windows in slow, patient gusts. The slate roof took it up in its slow, patient way. The gutters began to run. The barrels at the corners of the house, which Aina had told me on her first visit collected the rainwater for the garden, began to fill, and I heard, after a while, the small, soft sound of overflow as one of them filled past its lip and the water began to spill down its sides. I worked at my desk for 2 hours in the rain. La Maison Tranquille had reached a chapter in which Henri spends a long afternoon indoors during a storm, and I read the passage aloud to myself in French and then in my draft English, and then I made small adjustments to the English, listening to my own rain on my own roof to check the rhythm. It seemed to me, as I worked, that Cécile Boucher would have approved of this method. She had written the passage in her own house in the lot, and she would have known about rain. And she would have agreed, I thought, that you cannot translate a storm well unless you have a storm to compare it to. I stopped at 4. The light in the study was beginning to fade. I went downstairs. I put another sod on the fire. I lit 2 candles and the oil lamp on the dresser. I drew the small rocking chair closer to the hearth. The room took on its evening character, the dim, warm gold of fire and lamp, the deeper shadows in the corners, the soft glow of the whitewashed walls. The rain continued steadily outside, and I could hear, in addition, the long, low note of the sea, which had grown louder with the wind. There was a knock at the door. I rose. I opened it. Mrs. Keneally stood on the step in a long oilskin coat and a black sou'wester, with a basket on her arm and a small smile on her face. Behind her, much taller than her, stood a man in a similar oilskin and an old tweed cap. He held an umbrella that was doing very little against the rain. He was perhaps 65, with a long, lean face and a clean-shaven jaw, and a great many wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. "I am sorry to come unannounced, Mr. Marsh," Ina said, "but I was passing, and I wanted to bring you these, and I have brought someone you should meet." "Please come in," I said. They came in. I helped them with their coats. They stamped their feet politely on the mat. The man removed his cap and ran a hand over his short gray hair. Aini set her basket on the table. "A little stew," she said, "and a small loaf, and a piece of the cake we had at the sale last Sunday, which keeps well." She turned to the man. "This is Mr. Marsh," she said. "Edmund, this is my husband's cousin, Joseph Foley. He has come down to stay with us for a few weeks. He is from Dublin. He has known your aunt longer than any of us. I thought you would like to meet him." Joseph Foley held out his hand. It was a long, thin hand, with a slow, gentle grip. "A pleasure," he said. His voice was deeper than his frame suggested, and the Dublin in it had been softened by long years of living, I would later learn, in many places. "I am very sorry for the loss of your aunt. She was a friend of my younger years. We used to write to each other for a long time. Then we lost the habit, and then we found it again. I am glad to meet her nephew and to see her house alive." "Will you both have some tea?" I asked. They would, they said. I put the kettle on the hook. I gathered 3 cups and a small jug of milk. Ana sat down on the settle, and Joseph Foley took the rocking chair, with my permission, and sat back in it with a small sigh of pleasure, the way a tall man sighs when he has been on his feet for some time and has at last found a chair tall enough to suit him. We talked. We talked easily, and not in any hurry. Ina told me about the village's preparations for the autumn, about a fair that would happen in 3 weeks, about a christening at the church the Sunday after next that she hoped I would come to, because the family of the child were good neighbors. Joseph told me about his journey from Dublin, which he had taken by train and then by bus, and which had taken the better part of a day. He told me about his work, which had been in libraries, and which he had retired from a few years before. He told me about my aunt's letters to him, which he had kept, and which he would, if I were interested, lend me to read. I said that I would be very interested. The tea boiled. I made it. I poured. The rain went on outside. The fire shifted and settled. Tess came in from somewhere, walking with a slight indignant air that suggested she had been caught in the rain and considered the rain very poor manners on the part of the world, and she sat down by the hearth and began to wash herself. Joseph Foley watched her. "That is a very fine cat," he said. "She is the village's cat," I said. "Her name is Tess." "Of course," said Joseph Foley, as though he had known this all along. He bent and held out a hand to her. She considered him gravely, came over, sniffed his fingers, and allowed herself to be stroked. I had the impression that Joseph Foley knew cats, and that the cats of the world knew it, and treated him accordingly. We drank our tea. We ate a slice each of the cake Ana had brought, which turned out to be a heavy brown cake full of dried fruit and just enough spice to make it interesting. The conversation moved easily from one small subject to another, and I felt, sitting at my round table with my 2 guests and my fire and the rain, that I had been welcomed not just into a house but into a way of life. I had not made friends in some time. I had had acquaintances in the city and editors and colleagues, but I had not made friends in the way that I felt I was making friends now, with Ana and with Bridget and with Patrick and with Neil the baker, and now with Joseph Foley. It is one of the great quiet generosities of a small place that it lets a person make friends slowly, the way one makes a fire, with kindling and care. Joseph Foley stayed perhaps an hour. Ina stayed with him. When they rose to go, I said that I would walk down with them. But Ina said no. The rain was steady but not hard, and they would manage. They put on their oilskins. Joseph put on his cap. At the door he turned and said, "I will bring your aunt's letters tomorrow, if I may, and we can read them together by the fire. I think you would like to hear some of them. She had a very fine voice on the page." "I would like that very much," I said. "Tomorrow, then," he said. They went out. I watched them down the path. They disappeared into the rain. The cottage held its warmth around me, and Tess, having decided that the visitors had been satisfactory, came over and sat on my lap. I read for a while. The rain went on. I made myself a small supper of Anna's stew and bread. I ate slowly. I went to bed early. The rain was still falling. I slept under the patchwork quilt and heard, through the deep good dark, the rain on the slates. It went on all night. It did not stop until just before dawn. When I woke, the sun was rising on a washed and shining world, and the harbor below me was glassy again, and a thin pearl mist lay along the water, and the smell of wet earth and sea salt and turf smoke came in at the open window in great soft draughts. I rose and dressed and went down and made the fire. The cottage was at its best in the mornings after rain. Every surface seemed cleaner. Every sound seemed clearer. The world had been washed, and the cottage had stayed dry, and I was glad to be alive in it. Joseph Foley came up the following afternoon, as he had promised. He came alone, carrying a small leather satchel under his arm. with a thick cardigan over his shirt and a walking stick in his right hand. The walking stick, I would learn, was not strictly for walking. It was for emphasis. Joseph Foley liked to make a point by tapping the floor with the brass tip of his stick, and he liked to indicate a passage in a book by laying the stick across the page. And he liked, occasionally, when telling a particular story, to draw the shape of a thing in the air with his stick, as though the air would remember it. We sat by the fire. I made tea. He took the rocking chair again. He opened his satchel. I have brought, he said, about 30 of her letters. Not all of them. The others are at home in Dublin. But these are the ones I thought you would like best. He laid them out on the table beside him. They were in their envelopes, each addressed in a hand I recognized immediately, although I had only seen it a few times. A clear, upright hand, slightly slanting, with very precise capitals and very generous spacing. The envelopes were arranged by date. The earliest was from 1962. The latest was from 2024. I will not read all of them today, he said. Today I will read 3. You will sit and listen, and we will see how you find them. I sat. He took up the first envelope. He opened it carefully. He drew out a single sheet of writing paper, pale blue, folded in 3. He smoothed it on his knee. He fitted on a pair of reading glasses and adjusted them. This one is from October 1973, he said. She was 31. She had been living at Cregmore for a year by then. I had written to her the month before, asking her how she found the winters. This is her answer. He began to read. His voice, deeper than his frame suggested, settled into the rhythm of the letter at once, and I had the strong, sudden sense as he read that I was hearing my aunt speak. The letter was about the cottage. It described the first signs of autumn, the way the apples turned, the way the wind began to come from a new quarter, the way the seabirds gathered in greater numbers on the rocks of the harbor as the season drew in. It described a walk she had taken along the south path to Carrick Bay, where she had sat for an hour and watched a single seal swim back and forth in the calm water. It described a fire she had made in the cottage on the evening she came home. It described a meal of bread and cheese and the first apples of the year. It ended, I am not lonely, Joseph. I think that is the news. I have come a long way to be not lonely, and I have made it. I will write again at Christmas. Joseph Foley folded the letter. He set it down. He looked at me over his glasses. That is her, he said. That is exactly her. She did not waste a word. She did not say anything she did not mean. When she said she was not lonely, she meant it. I had not known, until I read that letter, that I had been worrying about her. I had not known I had been worrying, and then I read that, and I stopped worrying, all in the same moment. He took up the second letter. This one was longer. It was from 1985. It described the building of the small woodshed at the back of the garden, which she had done largely herself, with the help of a man from the village named Brendan Cassidy, who had been a young man at the time and had since died. The letter described, with great affection, the way Brendan had hummed while he worked, the way he had eaten his lunch with great gusto, the way he had refused all payment except a small flask of whiskey at the end of each day. The letter described the smell of the new timber, the way the wood shavings had piled up around their feet, the sound of the hammers, the small accomplishments of each evening. It ended with my aunt's reflection that there are few greater pleasures in life than building a small, useful thing with one's own hands and the help of a generous neighbor, and that she expected to keep firewood in this shed for the next 40 years, and to think of Brendan each time she carried in a load of it. Joseph Foley folded this one too. He said it on the first letter. He looked at me again over his glasses. She kept her word, he said. She did keep firewood in that shed for the next 40 years. The shed is still there. The shed will still be there 100 years from now, I should think, the way it is built. Brendan was a good builder. So was she. He took up the third letter. This one was the most recent. It was from June 2024, perhaps a month before she had gone into the hospital. It was short. "My dear Joseph," he read, "the summer is fine here. I have been sitting more than walking lately. I find the bench by the gate to be the best place for sitting, because from there I can see both the sea and the garden, and either one of them is enough on most days. Tess comes by every afternoon. She is a great consolation. I have been thinking lately about my brother's children, whom I have not seen in years, and in particular about Edmund. He always seemed to me a quiet child. I should like to leave the cottage to him, if it is not too presumptuous. I think he would understand it. I think it would not surprise him to be quiet here. I have written to Brendan, my solicitor, about this. Forgive me for being sentimental. I find I am sentimental in the afternoons now. Yours always, Ellen." Joseph Foley folded the letter slowly. He set it on the others. He did not look at me at once. When he did, his face was kind and grave. "She did not call you Edmund by accident," he said. "She remembered you. She remembered everyone until the very end. She was not a sentimental woman as a rule. She had her sentimental afternoons, but she did not write them out unless she was sure of them. She was sure of you. I did not say anything. I did not need to." He understood. He laid his long hand on the small pile of letters and patted them gently, as one pats the head of a child. "You will read them all in time," he said. "I will leave them with you when I go back to Dublin. They are yours by right. I have had them long enough." "Thank you," I said, and my voice was steadier than I had thought it would be. He nodded. He folded his reading glasses and put them away in his shirt pocket. He picked up his stick. He looked around the room. "It is the same room," he said. "It is exactly the same room. I have not been in it for 15 years. I had thought it might have changed. It has not changed. The settle is in the same place. The dresser is in the same place. The teapot is in the same place. I think your aunt would not have moved anything in this cottage on principle, after a certain age. I think she would have considered it a kind of disrespect." "I have not moved anything either," I said. He smiled. "Good," he said. "Don't. Not for a long time. The cottage knows where it wants its things. Let it keep them." We sat for a while longer. We drank a second cup of tea. We talked of other matters, of his life in Dublin, of the city in autumn, of a book he was writing about old Irish libraries, of the year he had spent in Italy as a young man, and the bread he remembered from a particular village in Umbria. He told me that bread, in his experience, was the truest measure of a place, that one could not love a village whose bread one did not love, and that one could be sure of loving any village whose bread had moved one to silence even once. I told him about Niall's brown loaf. He nodded approvingly. "Then you are in the right place," he said. He rose to go in the late afternoon. I walked him to the door. The light outside was the pale, clear gold of the autumn afternoon, and the harbor below was very still, and a single boat was coming in around the headland with its small sail set, and the seabirds were calling. He paused on the step. "Mr. Marsh," he said, "I am glad to have met you. I am glad to know that her house is in good hands." "Mr. Foley," I said, "the pleasure is mine. I hope you will come again before you go back." "I will," he said. "I will come at least twice more before I leave." He walked down the path. I watched him go. He walked slowly, with the stick, but with a deliberate, even pace that ate the distance well. He turned at the lane and waved his stick at me without looking back, and I lifted my hand. He went on out of sight. I went back into the cottage. The fire was low. The pile of letters lay on the table by the rocking chair. I sat down and looked at them for a long time, but I did not open any of them. I would read them slowly, over many evenings. I would not rush. They had waited a long time. They could wait a little longer for me to be ready. October deepened. The air grew cooler. The wind shifted further to the north, and the morning frosts came down to the lower garden, leaving the grass white and brittle until the sun came over the hill and turned it back to green. The apples on the old trees, what little of them had remained, fell one by one with small, soft thumps, and I gathered them into a basket and put the bruised ones in a bowl on the dresser, where they slowly softened, and the unbruised ones I cooked down with sugar and a stick of cinnamon to make a small jar of compote that I ate over my breakfast porridge for a week. The garden, which had been so wild when I arrived, was beginning to look modest and tended. I worked steadily in the upstairs study. La Maison Tranquille had reached its middle chapters, the slow heart of the book in which not much happens, but everything matters. Henri walked in his mother's garden. Henri sat by his mother's fire. Henri ate his mother's bread. The simplicity of the book was its great difficulty as a translation. Every sentence had to be made to ring as quietly as it had rung in French, and every adjective had to be considered, and I sometimes spent half an hour on a single line. I did not mind. The hours of slow, careful work were among the most contented hours of my life. The typewriter clicked, the carriage returned, the seabirds cried over the harbor. Tess, who had begun to spend more of her time at the cottage, lay on the rug under the desk and slept with her head on her paws. In the afternoons I walked or worked in the garden or went down to the village. I had begun to know the village by then. I had begun to know not only the names of the people I met, but the names of their dogs, and the names of the children who played outside their houses, and the names of the boats in the harbor. I knew which days were the days the post boat went out, and which days the trawler called the Mercanat fished for mackerel, and which days the trawler called the St. Joseph fished for crab. I knew that the man with the limp who walked his collie up the lane every morning at 9:30 was called Liam, and that he was a retired schoolmaster, and that his collie was called Beeg, which meant small, though the collie was no longer small. I knew that the children who sang in the church choir practiced on Thursday evenings at 6, and I could hear their high voices from the cottage if the wind was right, drifting up the hill in fragments of hymns and rounds. I had begun, in other words, to belong. I had not asked to belong, and the village had not announced that I belonged, and yet it had happened, in the slow, patient way that such things happen in such places, simply by my being there week after week, and walking the same streets, and stopping at the same shops, and saying the same hellos. By the end of October, I no longer felt like a visitor. By the end of October, the village had stopped calling me Mr. Marsh, except in the post office, where Bridget called everyone by their full name on principle, and had begun to call me Edmund. It was during this same week, late in October, that I met the lighthouse keeper. There was a lighthouse perhaps a mile north of the village, on a low headland called Cregmore itself, which was the same name as my cottage, and after which my cottage had been named. The headland was the Rock of the Watching, and the watching, in the original sense of the name, had been done from a small stone tower on its tip that had long since fallen down. The current lighthouse stood where the old tower had stood. It was a white tower perhaps 30 feet tall, with a black band around its top and a small lantern room above. It had not, for many years, been kept by a keeper. Most lighthouses in the country had been automated long ago, but this lighthouse had retained by some peculiarity of local arrangement a part-time keeper, a man who did not live in the lighthouse but who walked up to it 3 times a week to clean its lens and check its workings, and who had been doing this for 40 years. His name was Murta Hosala. He was perhaps the oldest man in the village. He must have been close to 90. He walked with 2 sticks, and very slowly, but he walked every day. I had seen him before, sitting on a bench outside the post office, but I had not spoken to him. Padruk had told me about him. Bridget had told me about him. Mrs. Keneally had told me about him. Each of them had told me separately that I should meet him before the winter set in, because he had been a great friend of my aunt's and had not been well since her death. I had been putting off the meeting. I had been putting it off in the small, irrational way one puts off any meeting one wants very much to go well. But on this particular Wednesday, in late October, the day was so fine, and the air so clean and golden, and the path along the north shore so inviting, that I decided I would walk out to the lighthouse, and that I would call on the keeper if I found him there. I set out after lunch. I walked along the harbor wall and out onto the north path. The path climbed gently. The sea on my right was a deep, clean blue, the kind of blue one sees only on autumn afternoons after a long stretch of clear weather, and the grass on the cliffs was a tawny gold. A few sheep watched me pass. A single gull rode the updraft along the cliff edge, hanging almost motionless against the wind. The lighthouse came into view as I rounded the second bend, a small white finger on the headland. I came up to the lighthouse just before 3. The door at the base was open. A figure was sitting on a stone bench beside it, in the sun, in a great brown overcoat, with his 2 sticks leaning against the wall. He looked up as I approached. He had a long, narrow face, and great drooping white eyebrows, and pale blue eyes that were very clear in spite of his age. "You'll be Edmund," he said. He did not say it as a question. "I am," I said. "Sit down," he said. I sat. The bench was warm in the sun. He looked at me for a long moment without speaking, in the way that very old people sometimes look at one, as though they are reading a book one cannot see oneself. "Ellen used to say you had her brother's face," he said at last. "She said you had her brother's hands. I had not seen her brother in 50 years when she said it. I have not seen him in 56 years now, but I would know the face from the description. She gave a good description. I am sorry I did not come sooner," I said. "You came when you came," he said. "There is no other way to come. Don't apologize." He moved his hand a little, as though waving away a small fly. "How is the cottage?" "It is well," I said. "Is the fire good?" "It is good." "Are you keeping the chimney swept?" "I have it on my list to do," I said. He nodded. "Do it before the deep cold. A chimney that is not swept will smoke when the wind turns, and you will sit in the smoke and not know why. Do it before the deep cold." "I will," I said. We sat for a while in the sun. He breathed slowly. He had a faint wheeze that I could hear when he was quiet. After a time he said, "Have you been up to the lantern room?" "No," I said. "Come up," he said. "I will go up with you. It is a slow climb, but I can do it. I have done it 3 times this week." He rose carefully, with both sticks, and led me to the door. The inside of the lighthouse was a narrow space, with a spiral iron stair rising up the wall. There was a single round room at the bottom, with a desk and a small chair and a glass cabinet of brass instruments, all very clean. He led me to the stairs. "You go up first," he said. "I will follow. Don't help me. I do not need help. I only need not to be hurried." We went up. It was a slow climb. I stopped often. He came up behind me, 1 sticked step at a time. The stair turned, and at last we came out into the lantern room, a small bright room at the top, with windows on every side, and the great brass and glass lens of the light in the center. The view from the top was extraordinary. From here I could see the whole of Cregmore Bay, the village clustered around the harbor, the cottage above it on the rise, the 3 islands out to sea, the long line of the mainland coast running north and south as far as the eye could follow. The light came in from every direction. The sea was a deep blue stitched with white. The land was a patchwork of greens and golds and browns. A single fishing boat was making for the harbor, leaving a long white trail behind it. The sky was almost cloudless, and the late afternoon sun was beginning to lengthen its light. Murta stood beside me for a long time, breathing slowly, leaning on his sticks, looking out. "This is what I am paid for," he said at last. He smiled very slightly. "They pay me a small pension to keep the lens clean. They pay me almost nothing. But what they actually pay me for is this." He gestured with his chin at the view. "They pay me for the climb. They pay me for the looking. I have been looking at this view for 40 years. I will look at it as long as I can climb the stair." We stood looking for a long while. Then he turned and said, "Tea downstairs?" "Yes," I said. We went down, more slowly than we had gone up, and he made tea in the round room at the bottom on a small spirit stove, in a brown teapot very like the one in my cottage. We sat in 2 old wooden chairs by the desk. He poured carefully, with the slow concentration of a man whose hands sometimes shake but who refuses to let them shake when he is pouring tea. We drank. He asked me about my work, and I told him about La Maison Tranquille. He asked me to read him a paragraph in French, and I did, and he listened with his head on one side, and at the end he said, "I do not understand the French, but I like the sound of it. Your aunt spoke a little French. She read it better than she spoke it. She had a good ear for sounds." He asked me about my walk to the lighthouse. He asked me about the cat. He asked me about the apples. He asked me about Padraig. He asked me about Joseph Foley, whom he had known since 1969, when Joseph had visited my aunt for the first time. He told me that Joseph had once helped him replace a broken pane in the lantern room on a stormy night, and that it had taken them 4 hours, and that they had drunk a bottle of whiskey at the end of it. He told me this with great satisfaction, as though the 4 hours and the bottle of whiskey had been one of the better arrangements he had made in his life. We sat for perhaps 2 hours. The sun slid down toward the headland, and the light in the round room dimmed. He told me that he must rest before the walk back, and I rose to go. At the door he said, "Come again. I am here on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Come on any of those days. Come most of them." "I will," I said. I walked back along the path in the long slanting light. The lighthouse threw a long shadow now, lying like a black finger across the gold grass. The sea was deepening to a darker blue. The first lights of the village were beginning to show. I walked slowly. I felt that I had been given a great deal that afternoon, and I wanted to walk slowly enough to receive it. I came back into the village just before dark. I stopped at the baker's and bought a small loaf for the morning. I walked up the lane to the cottage. The cottage was waiting. Tess was sitting on the wall. The smoke from the chimney rose in a thin, straight line into the evening sky. That night I made supper, and I read a few pages from the Edward Thomas, and I sat by the fire, and I did not write in my notebook. I did not need to. The day had been full enough to remember itself. November came in on a long, slow tide of gray weather. The mornings began to be dark. The fires had to be lit earlier and kept longer. The wind shifted again, this time to the west, and brought with it long banks of cloud that hung over the bay for days at a time, dropping their soft drizzle over the rocks and the slate roofs and the long autumn grass. The sea took on a heavier color, a deep slate gray that seemed almost black in the dim light, with white crests breaking far out beyond the harbor. I loved this weather. I had not expected to love it. I had thought, when I planned the year, that I would love the bright autumn and the deep cold winter and the green spring, and that I would tolerate the long, damp passage between them. But I was learning that the long, damp passage was its own pleasure, and that there is a deep, peculiar joy in a steady week of gray rain when one has a fire and a kettle and a book and a window over a harbor. I worked steadily on the translation. I had now finished half the book. Henri was in his late autumn. He had begun in the small, slow way that the book unfolded, to repair an old chair that had belonged to his father. The repair of the chair was, in Setebouchet's hands, both a literal repair and a kind of metaphor, though she was too good a writer to ever announce it as such. She let the chair be a chair. She let the father be the father. She let the reader make whatever weight they liked of the work of repair. I admired her for this very much. I tried to translate the chapter with the same restraint. In my own life, in those weeks, I had begun a few small repairs of my own. The kitchen door did not hang quite straight, and I had taken it off its hinges and planed a little off the bottom and rehung it. The latch on the garden gate had grown loose, and I had taken it apart and shimmed it with a small piece of leather from an old strap I had found in the woodshed. The third stair from the bottom had developed a creak. I could not, alone, fix that one, and I let it stay. I rather liked it. A creak in the third stair was the sort of small inconvenience that became, in time, a small companion. On a wet afternoon I had cleaned out a low cupboard in the kitchen and found, behind a stack of old plates, a small wooden box. It was a plain pine box, perhaps a foot long and 6 inches deep, with a tin clasp. I lifted it out. I opened it on the kitchen table. Inside were 4 leather-bound notebooks, all the same size, and at the bottom a small, flat case containing what turned out to be a pair of reading glasses, very old, with thin gold rims. The notebooks were my aunt's. They were not letters. They were not diaries exactly in the usual sense. They were notebooks of the kind that some people keep all their lives, in which they write down whatever interests them at a given moment. A quotation from a book, a recipe, a sketch of a bird, the weight of a fish caught by a neighbor, the names of guests at a tea, the weather of a particular morning, a poem half remembered, an observation about the light. They were dated. The earliest was from 1970. The most recent, the fourth, ended in May 2024. Only a few weeks before she had gone into the hospital. I sat at the kitchen table for a long while with the notebooks in front of me. I did not open them at random. I did not want to disturb them. I closed the box. I carried it carefully upstairs to the study and set it on the desk. I would read them, I thought, as I had read the letters, slowly, in their own time. I would not rush. They had waited a long time. They could wait a little longer for me to be ready. That evening I lit the fire early. I made a small supper of bread and cheese. I sat by the fire with Tess on my lap. The rain was steady outside, and the wind was making the chimney sing its low note. I had brought one of the notebooks down with me. I opened it at last. It was the earliest, the 1970 notebook. The first page bore only 2 words. In her clear, upright hand, Cregmore, October. The next page began an entry. I read it slowly. The cottage has stood since 1838. The deed is in a tin box on top of the dresser. The roof was retiled in 1947. The chimney was rebuilt in 1962 after a fall of stone in a winter storm. The previous owners were the Sullivan family, who held the cottage for 91 years, and before them the McGowans, who held it from 1838 until 1882. The cottage was built by a man named Patrick McGowan, who had returned from America with enough money to put up a stone house on a piece of land he had bought from his cousin. The land had been pasture before. The first chimney smoked badly. The second chimney, the present one, smokes only when the wind is in the northeast. I smiled at this. I made a small mental note about the wind. I read on. The next entry was about a walk she had taken in November of 1970 along the very north path I had walked to the lighthouse. She had described the path and the sheep on the cliffs and the way the gorse smelled in the cold air and the way the lighthouse looked at sunset. She had described the lighthouse keeper, who had then been a younger man with a great mustache and a great laugh. She had described how he had asked her in for tea and shown her the lantern room. She had ended the entry. I think I will love it here. I think I will love it here for as long as I live. I read perhaps 10 pages of the notebook. I had no urge to read more. The notebook would last. It had lasted half a century. It could last me a winter and longer. I closed it. I set it on the table beside me. I sat for a while with Tess on my lap, listening to the rain and the fire and the slow, soft breathing of the cottage. Ina came up the next morning with a basket of eggs. She often came up now 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes just to bring something small and sit for a quarter of an hour. She had told me, on one of her early visits, that she had got used to coming up the hill to see my aunt, and that she missed the going up the hill more than she had expected to, and that she hoped I did not mind. I had told her that I welcomed her every visit. I did. The visits had a particular shape that I had come to look forward to. She would come in, set down her basket, refuse a chair, accept a cup of tea, sit for a quarter of an hour while we talked, and rise and go. The whole thing took the same amount of time each visit, as if she had measured it out exactly, and I rather think she had. On that morning, while we drank our tea, I told her about the notebooks. Her face lit. She had not known they were there. She used to keep them on the desk upstairs, she said. She must have moved them at some point, perhaps when she was making room for something. I had not seen them in years. I am very glad you found them. There are 4 of them, I said. I have begun the first. Don't read them too fast, Ina said. Read them slowly. They are a long, good company. I plan to, I said. She smiled. She finished her tea. She rose. She picked up her basket, which was now empty. She paused at the door. Are you well, Edmund? She asked. I mean really well. I have been thinking about it. I considered the question. I am, I said, after a moment. I am very well. I am better than I have been in a long time. She nodded, satisfied. Good, she said. Good. The cottage is doing its work. I knew it would. She went out. I went up to the study. I worked. I came down in the afternoon and walked. I came back and made supper and ate by the fire. I read a little more of the notebook. I went to bed. I slept. The days went on. They were good days. The first snow came on a Monday in late November. I had not expected snow yet. The weather had been damp and cool but not cold, and the village people had told me that the heavy snow rarely came before Christmas. But that Monday morning I woke to a strange quality of light, a softer, paler light than I had become used to. And I went to the seaward window and looked out and saw that the whole world had been redescribed overnight in white. It was not a heavy snow. It was perhaps 2 inches deep on the garden wall and a little less on the open ground, but it lay everywhere. The slate roofs of the village below were soft white slopes. The boats in the harbor wore small white caps. The lane up to the cottage was a white ribbon. The garden was a sheet of unbroken white, except where a single line of small, careful prints, perhaps a cat's, perhaps Tess's, led from the gate to the kitchen door and stopped there. I opened the door. The cold came in. Tess sat on the step looking up at me with mild indignation. I bent and let her in. She walked with great dignity to the fire and sat down and began to clean her paws of snow, which was a serious matter, and required her full attention for several minutes. I went out into the garden. The snow was light and dry. It crunched under my feet in a small, soft way that I had not heard in years. I walked to the gate and stood looking down at the village. Smoke rose from every chimney. The harbor was very still in the white. The sea, beyond the headland, was a deep, dark blue against the new white land. The world was very quiet. I could hear, very faintly, the bells of cattle in a field far up the lane. I could hear, more clearly, the slow, soft murmur of the sea against the rocks below. There were no other sounds at all. I stood there for perhaps a quarter of an hour. I was not cold. I was wearing the heavy wool jumper I had bought from the wool shop in the village 2 weeks before, and a knitted cap that Ina had pressed on me on her last visit, saying that the winter wind would come for my ears. I stood and watched the snow on the village. I watched a man come out of his door, look up at the sky, look down at the snow, and go back inside. I watched a child appear at a window, press her face to the glass, and then disappear. I watched a single seabird fly slowly over the harbor and land on its usual bollard, where it stood looking offended at the white world. I went back inside. I made the fire bigger than usual. I made a great pot of coffee. I made porridge with milk and a spoonful of honey. I ate slowly at the round table, looking out at the white village through the seaward window. The morning was very good. I felt that I had been given a particular kind of gift, a winter morning at the cottage, and that I should pay attention to it. I worked at my desk for 2 hours. The light in the study was extraordinary. The snow on the slate roof above had a soft, luminous quality, and it bounced its light back through the window in a way that made the whole room seem to glow gently. I worked on a chapter of La Maison Tranquille in which Henri, in his French village, walks in the first snow of his own season. The chapter was short and very beautiful, and I worked on it with particular care. In the afternoon I went down to the village. The lane was treacherous in places, with the snow hiding the stones, and I walked carefully. The village was alive with quiet activity. People who would normally have been about their indoor work were out in the street, talking. The snow had made everyone want to come out and see. Children were sliding on a steep bit of pavement near the harbor, supervised by an old woman who was laughing and shouting affectionate threats. A few dogs were running circles in the snow, exhilarated. At the baker's where I stopped, Niall was in great spirits. "First snow," he said when I came in. "I have made a special bread today, a snow bread. It has dates in it. It is very good. Try a piece." He cut me a slice and pushed it across the counter. I ate it. It was warm and rich and full of the dark, sweet stickiness of the dates. It was very good. I bought a small loaf. I walked to the harbor. Padraig was there, on the wall, looking at his boat. He saw me and waved. "Not going out today?" I called. "Not today," he said. "The deck is too slippy. I will go tomorrow if the snow holds off." He smiled. "It is a fine day for staying in." He looked at the harbor with great affection, as though the snowy boats were children he was very proud of. I walked up to the post office. Bridget was inside, sitting behind the counter with a cup of tea, very pleased with the snow. "Edmund," she said, "have you seen it from your window?" "I have." "Is the cottage warm enough?" "It is." "Have you split enough wood?" "I have." "Have you eaten today?" "I have." She nodded approvingly. "Then you are ready," she said. "The snow will not get much heavier tonight. It will melt by Thursday, but there will be more. There always is more, from now until February." I bought a few small things. I left. I walked up the lane to the cottage. The cottage looked, when I came up to it, more beautiful than I had ever seen it. The whitewashed walls had a soft gold tinge from the low afternoon sun. The slate roof was clean white. The chimney smoke was a thin, straight line against the pale sky. Tess was sitting in the kitchen window, watching me come. I let myself in. I put fresh wood on the fire. I sat down on the settle with the snow bread and a cup of tea. Tess came over and sat on my lap. I read for a while. The day deepened. The snow began, very lightly, again in small, slow flakes. I watched it through the window. I felt that I had been here a long time, longer than 2 months. I felt that I was at home. That evening, Amy came up, with Joseph Foley behind her, both of them well wrapped against the cold. They had come up the slippery lane very carefully, leaning on each other a little. Joseph had a small parcel under his arm. "We thought we would come and see the cottage in the snow," Ina said. Joseph said your aunt always loved the cottage in the first snow. She did, said Joseph. She would stand in the doorway and look out at the white garden and say it was as if the cottage had had a fresh coat of paint, but better. I welcomed them in. I made tea. I added another sod to the fire. Tess greeted Joseph with the small, dignified hello she now gave him every time, walking over and pressing her side against his trouser leg. He stroked her absently as he sat down. Joseph handed me the parcel. A small thing, he said. I wanted to give you something while I was here. I leave in 2 days. I opened it. It was a book. It was a thin volume bound in dark green cloth, very plain, with no title on the spine. I looked at him. Open it, he said. I opened it. The title page read, Translations from the Italian, by Edmund Marsh, privately printed, Cregmore, 1986. I caught my breath. I had not known. I had known from Amy's first visit that my aunt had translated something from the Italian, but I had not known that the translation had been printed. I leafed slowly through the book. It was a small book, perhaps 80 pages, with the Italian and the English on facing pages. The Italian was a sequence of letters from a 19th century Italian writer to her sister. The English was my aunt's. I read a paragraph. The English was lovely. It was unobtrusive and warm and very precise, and it carried the rhythm of the Italian without imitating it. There are only 30 copies, Joseph said. She had them made for her friends. She gave me one. I have read it many times. I think it is the best translation of those letters that has ever been done. I want you to have it now. I am sure she meant for you to have one. She did not know at the time that there would be a nephew who could read it. I did not know what to say. I closed the book carefully. I held it in my lap. Thank you, I said. I will say no more about it, said Joseph. Tea? We drank our tea. We talked of small things. The fire burned high and good. Outside the snow drifted down in small, slow flakes, and the wind moved softly, and the cottage held its quiet warmth. Joseph and Amy stayed for an hour. When they rose to go, I walked with them down the lane to the village, going slowly, helping them where the lane was slippery, and at the bottom of the lane we said good night, and I watched them go down toward Amy's green door. I walked back up the lane alone. The village lights glowed gently behind me. The snow had stopped. The sky was clearing in the east, and a few stars were beginning to show. I came up to the cottage. I let myself in. The fire was low but holding. Tess was asleep on the settle. The book was on the round table where I had set it down. I sat in the rocking chair and opened the book and read a few of the letters by the firelight. My aunt's English was a quiet companion. I read for an hour. I read until the fire had burned down to embers and the room was very dim. Then I banked the fire and lit a candle and went up to bed. And I slept very long and very well. And in the morning the snow on the garden was already beginning to melt. And the sun was out, and the world was bright. Joseph Foley left 2 days later. I walked down to the village to see him off. He was being driven to the bus stop at the crossroads by a young man with a small van, who would take him there in plenty of time for the morning bus to the city. Ine was there. Bridget had come out from the post office. Niall, from the bakery, was leaning in his doorway with his apron on, watching. Joseph stood by the van, with his suitcase at his feet and his walking stick under his arm. He looked, in spite of his great age, very content. Mr. Marsh, he said to me, I will write to you. I will send you my book about the libraries when it is done. I will return in the spring, if the spring is kind to me. I will be here, I said. I know you will, he said. He smiled. That is one of the comforts of a place like this. One can leave it knowing that the cottage will be lit when one comes back. He shook my hand. He shook the hands of the others. He climbed slowly into the van. The young man started the engine. The van pulled away. Joseph waved through the window. We watched the van go up the lane until it disappeared around the bend, and then we stood for a moment longer, and then we all went our separate ways. I walked back up to the cottage. Ina walked back to her green door. Bridget went back into the post office. Niall went back into the warm smell of his oven. The cottage felt, when I came back to it, a little quieter than it had felt before. It was a small thing. I noticed it. I would not have noticed, 2 months earlier, the going away of a man I had met for the first time 3 weeks before, and I would not have felt a small particular quiet in a small particular cottage because of it. I noticed now. I had begun to be the kind of person who notices. December came in with a softer weather. The first snow had melted, and the second snow had not yet come, and the days became gray and damp again, with mornings of low mist over the harbor and afternoons of pale, weak sunshine. The village began, in its quiet way, to prepare for Christmas. I knew this was happening because Bridget told me, with the small, careful pride of someone who has known the calendar of the village for 40 years. She told me on a Tuesday afternoon that the choir would start its Christmas practices the following week and that the Christmas fair would be on the second Saturday of December at the church hall, and that there would be a Christmas Eve service at the church at 6 in the evening to which everyone in the village would come and to which I should come too. "Will you?" she asked. "I will," I said. I had not been to church regularly since I was a boy. I had been to Christmas services here and there over the years, in the way of a person who is not religious but who likes the music and the candlelight and the company. I thought this year that I would very much like to go. I thought that I would like to sit in the back pew of the small gray church on Christmas Eve with my new neighbors and listen to the choir and hear the readings and walk home up the lane to the cottage afterward. I thought it would be one of the right things to do in my new life. The Christmas fair was the second Saturday. It was held in the church hall, which was a small whitewashed building behind the church, with a stove at one end and a row of tables along the walls. I went down in the early afternoon. The hall was full of people. Ana had a table of jams and chutneys with neat handwritten labels. Niall had a long table of Christmas cakes and mince pies and dark sweet loaves, and was selling them as fast as he could wrap them. Rigid had a small table of cards and ribbons and a stack of paper cones full of homemade toffee. The wool shop had brought down a table of knitted things, scarves, socks, hats, mittens, a pile of small gray shawls in the local style. A few children were running about with paper crowns on their heads. A fiddle was playing in the corner, the same slow air I had heard the first week from the cottage, and I realized for the first time that the fiddler was the schoolmaster Liam, who I had seen so often walking his collie up the lane. I bought a jar of Ana's apple chutney. I bought a Christmas cake from Niall. I bought a pair of gray wool mittens from the wool shop. I bought a small paper cone of toffee from Bridget. I stood for a while listening to Liam play. I drank a cup of tea handed to me by a woman I did not know, who said her name was Maeve and that I had translated her cousin's favorite book. I did not know who her cousin was, but I thanked her, and she patted my arm and moved on. The whole afternoon had the warm, slow shape of a thing that has been done many times before and well. There was nothing hurried. There was nothing forced. The children played. The fiddle played. The fire in the stove burned high. The smell of the mince pies filled the hall. The dark of the early winter afternoon pressed against the windows, and the windows glowed yellow with the lamplight. I stayed for a long time. I had not expected to stay for a long time. I had thought I would buy a few things and go home, but I stayed until almost evening, walking slowly from table to table, listening to conversations, watching the children, and at last I went home up the lane in the soft gray dusk, with my parcels under my arm, and my hands deep in my coat pockets, and a small steady glow of warmth in my chest. The cottage was waiting. Tess was asleep on the settle. The fire was low. I made it up. I put the kettle on. I unpacked my parcels. The chutney on the dresser, the cake in the larder, the mittens in the basket of my own gloves and scarves by the door, the toffee on the round table. I sat by the fire with a cup of tea and a piece of toffee, and I let the day settle around me. In the next 2 weeks, I prepared for Christmas in a quiet way. I had decided, with no real ceremony about it, that I would spend Christmas at the cottage alone, except for the church service on Christmas Eve and a midday dinner with Anna and her husband Patrick on Christmas Day, to which they had invited me with great firmness. I did not want a great fuss. I wanted, for the rest of the season, the small private rituals that would make the cottage feel like a place where Christmas was kept. I went up into the wood above the village, with permission from the farmer whose land it was, and I cut a small fir from a stand of young trees, no taller than my chest. I carried it down on my shoulder. I set it in a bucket of earth in the corner of the main room near the seaward window. I did not have any decorations. I improvised. I tied small bows of red ribbon, bought from Bridget, to the ends of the branches. I cut out little stars from silver paper from the lining of a tea tin. I made a few small ornaments from rolled cones of paper that I had painted with watercolors I had brought from the city for proofing manuscripts. I set a small wooden candle holder, shaped like a horse, that I had found in a drawer, on top of the dresser. I lit a candle in it for an hour each evening, just for the look of it, while I worked. I baked, in the small range I had now learned to use, a batch of shortbread biscuits from a recipe Ana had written out for me on a piece of paper torn from a Bridget-bought notebook. The shortbread came out very well on the third batch. The first batch was burnt. The second was raw. The third was perfect. I gave a tin of them to Bridget, who pronounced them excellent, and a tin to Ana, who pronounced them better than her mother's had been, which was a high compliment, and I kept a tin for myself. In the evenings I read by the fire. I had begun to alternate between the 4 notebooks of my aunt's, dipping into one and then another, and then a third, as one dips into a book of essays. The notebooks gave me her year in pieces. They gave me a winter morning in 1973, and a summer afternoon in 1985, and a stormy night in 2001, and a quiet October walk in 2017. I came to know her better through the notebooks than I had known her in the 4 meetings of my childhood. She was a person of close observation and quiet attention. She did not say very much that was not worth saying. She loved birds. She loved trees. She loved the village. She loved Tess, who had been her cat too. She loved the lighthouse and its keeper, and Bridget, and Niall, and Padraig, and a great many people I did not know, but felt I would have liked. I would, by the time of Christmas, be halfway through the first notebook. I was reading slowly. I did not want to be done. Christmas Eve was a clear, cold day. The sun rose in a pale lemon sky, and a thin frost lay on the garden wall and on the slate roof, and the harbor was very still. I worked in the morning for 2 hours on a passage of La Maison Tranquille, in which Henri prepares a Christmas meal for himself in the kitchen of his mother's house. The passage was particular and fine. Sapin Boucher described the way Henri lit the candles on the table, the way he set out 2 glasses, the way he poured wine into one of them and left the other empty for a person who would not come, the way he ate slowly and read aloud a single passage from a book his mother had loved. The passage made me very still, the way fine writing about a quiet thing can make one very still. I worked on it slowly. I had time. The afternoon was free. I walked down to the village in the early afternoon. I had a few small things to deliver. I had a tin of shortbread for Padraig, and a tin for Bridget, and a tin for Niall, and a small bottle of good whiskey for Murtagh, who had told me, when I had asked him gently what he liked, that he had not changed his preferences in 50 years and saw no reason to start. I walked through the village with my small parcels. I gave them out one by one. At each house I was offered something in return: a slice of cake, a glass of sherry, a square of toffee, a cup of tea. I accepted some and refused others. I had learned by then the small grammar of village hospitality, the way to take an offered thing without taking too much, the way to refuse without giving offense. I stayed perhaps a quarter of an hour at each house, and at the end of the afternoon I had visited 6 houses and felt that I had not visited any of them as long as I would have liked. The last house was Murtaugh's. He did not live at the lighthouse, of course. He lived in a small cottage at the upper end of the village, with his sister Mare, who was younger than he and who kept house for him. Mare let me in. She was a small woman of perhaps 75, with bright black eyes and a great quiet warmth about her. Murtaugh was in the kitchen by the fire in a deep armchair with a rug over his knees. He looked up when I came in. "Edmund," he said, "sit down." I gave him the bottle. He took it with great formal pleasure, set it on a small table beside his chair, and made a small bow of his head. "You should not have," he said, "and I am very glad you did." We sat for a while. Mare brought tea and a slice of fruit cake. We talked of small things. Murtaugh asked me whether I would be at the church service. "I will," I said. "Then I will see you there," he said. "My heir will get me down the lane. We have done it for 40 years. We will do it again." He paused. "It is a good service. It is the best service of the year. They do not change it. They have not changed it in my memory. I would not let them change it if they tried." I left after a time. The afternoon was beginning to fade into the long blue of a winter evening. I walked back up the lane to the cottage. I made the fire up high. I had decided to have an early supper before the service. I made a small, simple meal. Soup from a pot I had made the day before, a piece of bread, a small piece of cheese, an apple. I ate it slowly at the round table. The candles in the window glowed. The fir tree in its corner stood quietly with its small red bows and its silver paper stars. The room was as it should be. I felt, sitting there, that I had made a Christmas. It was not the Christmas I had ever made before. It was a smaller Christmas, and a quieter Christmas, and a Christmas more thoroughly mine. I sat for a long while after I had finished eating, just looking around the room, taking it in. At 10 minutes before 6, I put on my coat and my new mittens and my cap. I banked the fire. I blew out the candles. I went out. The lane down to the church was already busy with quiet figures. Whole families were walking down. The children were excited but trying to be solemn. The old people were being walked carefully, each on someone's arm. I joined the small flow. People nodded to me. A child looked up at me and waved. A man whose name I had not yet learned wished me a happy Christmas. We came together at the church door. The church was full. It was lit with candles, perhaps 100 of them, in iron stands along the walls and on the windowsills and on the altar. The candlelight made everything golden. The thick stone walls were warm with it. The slate floor glimmered. The wooden pews glowed like dark honey. The smell was a fine particular smell of beeswax and turf smoke from the small stove at the back, and damp wool from 100 coats, and the faint sharpness of pine from a single small fir at the front of the church, decorated very simply with white ribbons. I found a seat in the back pew, beside an old woman I did not know. She smiled at me. I smiled back. We did not speak. The service began at 6. The choir was at the front. There were perhaps 12 of them, 6 children and 6 adults, with Liam at the organ. They sang a carol I knew very well, a simple old carol about a still night and a quiet birth, and they sang it in a clear, unaccompanied way, with Liam playing very gently underneath. The voices rose into the small old church and filled it, and the candles burned, and the people listened, and I sat with my new mittens folded in my lap and felt the warmth of the church settle into me. There was a reading. There was another carol. There was another reading. There was a short address from the priest, a young man new to the village. who spoke about peace and about quiet and about the gift of small-kept things, and who quoted, at one point, a line from a poet I had not heard since I was a student. He spoke briefly. He spoke well. There was another carol. There was a final reading. There was a benediction. The choir sang us out with a slow, soft last carol, and we stood and we went out into the cold dark. The night was clear. The stars were extraordinary. I stood for a moment outside the church door, looking up. The Milky Way was a faint, pale river overhead. Orion was rising over the eastern hills with his belt very bright. The cold of the night was clean and dry, and the air smelled of wood smoke and the sea. People were saying good night to each other in small, slow groups, lingering on the church steps. Happy Christmas. Happy Christmas. Sleep well. See you tomorrow. I walked up the lane with Amy and Patrick. They had appeared beside me without my noticing. Patrick was a tall, slow man, very kind, who said little but missed nothing. He had been at the service in the choir. He had sung baritone. They walked me up to the bend in the lane where their road and mine parted, and there we stopped. Tomorrow at 1, Ina said. Don't be late and don't bring anything. We have plenty. Tomorrow at 1, I said. Happy Christmas, Edmund, said Patrick. Happy Christmas, I said. I watched them go down the lane to their green door. I walked up to the cottage. The cottage was waiting. I let myself in. The fire was still glowing low under its ash. I uncovered it, added a sod, and watched it take. I lit a candle. I sat down on the settle. Tess came over and sat on my lap. I sat for a long while without doing anything. I did not need to do anything. The day had been a complete day in itself. I had eaten. I had walked. I had given small gifts and received small gifts. I had been to a service in the candlelit church with my neighbors. I had walked home under the stars with friends. The fire was warm. The cottage was warm. Tess was purring on my lap. After a long while I rose, banked the fire, lit a candle, and went up to bed. I lay under the patchwork quilt and listened to the cottage. The wind was very gentle outside. The sea was calm. I could hear nothing else. I lay for a few minutes in the dark, and then I slept, and I slept very deeply. And when I dreamed, which was rarely, I dreamed of nothing in particular, only of small, bright, peaceful things, the kind of dreams that leave no trace in the morning, but a soft, good feeling in the chest. I went to Ina and Patrick's at 1 on Christmas Day. They lived in a low, whitewashed house with a green door, 3 doors from the church, just as the first note from Ina had said. The door was open when I came up. The smell of roast meat and herbs drifted out into the lane. Patrick met me at the door and took my coat and pressed a small glass of sherry into my hand and led me into the front room. The front room was full. There were perhaps 8 people there. Ina's grandson and his wife, who had come down from the city for the day, Ina's daughter, who lived in the next village, a neighbor whose husband had been at sea for Christmas and who therefore had been invited along with her 2 children, Liam the schoolmaster, who I learned was Ina's brother-in-law and who came to Christmas every year, Murtaugh, sitting in a chair by the fire in a great wool jumper with his hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey, Mare beside him smiling. They greeted me as if I had always been there. They made room for me on the sofa. They began to ask me questions about the cottage, and about my work, and about whether I liked Christmas pudding, and about all the things one is asked at a Christmas table. We sat down at 1:30. The table was very long. Patrick had made it long by joining 2 tables together and covering them with a great white cloth. There were candles in brass holders and small bowls of holly. There was a roast goose at one end and a roast ham at the other, and dishes of potatoes and parsnips and red cabbage and a tureen of gravy in the middle, and at each place a small folded napkin with a cracker beside it. We pulled the crackers and put on the paper crowns. We said grace, we ate. The meal lasted almost 3 hours. The food was very good and very plentiful. There was wine, and after the wine there was whiskey, and after the whiskey there was tea. There was Christmas pudding, which Ein carried in flaming, to applause, and which we ate with whipped cream and a small drizzle of brandy. There was conversation, which moved from subject to subject in the slow, easy way of conversation at a long, unhurried table. There was, at one point, a song from Liam, who had been encouraged with a third whiskey, and who sang an old air with his hands folded on the table and his eyes closed, and at the end of which everyone was very quiet, and Murtagh said, "Good man," and we all moved on. There were stories from Murtagh about the lighthouse, and stories from Patrick about a boat he had once sailed in his youth to the Faroes, and stories from Aina's daughter about her own daughter, who was 12 and learning the fiddle. The children listened with great patience, knowing that their turn for the front of the conversation would come. I had not, in many years, sat at such a long, unhurried table. I had not, in many years, been part of a meal that did not have somewhere it needed to go after itself. I sat at the table with my paper crown a little askew, and my glass of wine half full and my plate cleared, and I listened to the conversation rise and fall around me. And I had the strong, settled feeling that this was the way Christmas was meant to be eaten, not as a hurried prelude to other obligations, not as an excuse for the giving of expensive things, not as a performance, as a long, warm afternoon of food and company and stories, at a table that had been arranged for the purpose, with no clock in the room. We rose from the table at 4:30. Aine and the women cleared. The men went into the front room. Murtagh dozed in his chair by the fire. Patrick brought down a small box of old photographs and showed me a few of my aunt, a young woman with her hair pinned up, standing in front of the cottage in 1972, on the day she had bought it, an older woman with white hair holding a teacup on the settle in 1995, an older woman still, sitting on the bench by the gate at Carrick Fair, with Tess on her lap in 2018. I held the photographs for a long time. I had not known any of them. Patrick told me, with the easy patience of a man who has shown old photographs to many people, the small stories of each one. I listened. I asked questions. I let myself slowly fill in the picture of the woman who had given me my house. I stayed until perhaps 7. Then I rose and made my farewells. Anna pressed on me a small parcel of leftovers, a slice of goose and a slice of pudding and a piece of cake, all carefully wrapped in waxed paper. Patrick walked me to the door. The night was clear and cold and very still. I shook his hand and thanked him, and Anna kissed me on the cheek and told me to come back any time I liked, and I went out into the lane and walked up to the cottage. The lane was very quiet. The houses were lit with candles in the windows, the local way of marking Christmas, and the candles glowed yellow against the deep dark of the windows. The stars overhead were extraordinary again. The sea below the village murmured very softly. I came up to the cottage and let myself in and made the fire up. I sat by the fire for an hour. I did not read. I did not work. I did not even drink tea, having drunk a great deal of it at Ina's. I just sat. Tess sat on my lap. I thought, in a soft, slow way, about my aunt. I thought about the cottage. I thought about Ina, and Patrick, and Murtagh, and Mare, and Liam, and the choir, and the small candles in the windows of the village. I thought about Joseph Foley in Dublin, and Cecil Boucher in the lot, and Henri in his mother's quiet house. I thought about the small, bright thing that the day had been. I thought, finally, with no particular emotion, only with a slow, soft certainty, that I would stay at Carrick Fair for a long time. I would stay for years, perhaps. I would stay as long as I was wanted, and I would not ask anyone whether I was wanted, because I had begun to understand that asking was the wrong gesture for this place. I would just live here. The cottage would tell me, in its own time, whether I should stay, and so far it had told me only yes. When the fire burned low, I rose and banked it, and lit a candle and went up to bed. I slept long and slept well. The night was very still, and the cottage was very warm. The wind did not rise. The sea was quiet. I slept until the late winter dawn, when the light came through the seaward window very pale and soft, and I woke to the sound of a single gull calling out over the harbor, and to Tess purring at the foot of the bed, where she had stayed all night. The new year came in quietly. There was no great party at the village. There was a gathering at the pub on New Year's Eve, where I went for an hour and drank a single glass of stout and listened to Liam play a few tunes. And at midnight everyone clasped hands in a circle and sang a song I knew, and then everyone went home. I walked up the lane in the dark. The cottage was warm. I slept. I woke in the new year, which felt no different from the old year, which is the way New Year's feel in places that have learned not to make much of them. January and February were the deep heart of the winter. The cold came in properly. There were several more snows, none of them very heavy, and several long stretches of clear frost. The harbor froze around its edges, with thin plates of ice forming overnight near the wall and breaking up by midday. The wind came hard from the north for 2 weeks, and I learned, as Murtaugh had told me I would, what a chimney does when the wind is in the northeast. I had had the chimney swept in early December on Murtaugh's advice, and so it smoked only a little, and only at certain hours, and I learned to bank the fire low when the wind was in that particular quarter. I worked steadily. In the upstairs study with the snow on the slate roof and the ice on the harbor below. La Maison Tranquille moved toward its end. Henri came to the last chapter of his quiet autumn. He sat at his mother's table for the last time before closing the house up for the winter. He folded his mother's apron. He wound her clock for the last time. He went out and stood in the orchard and watched a single bird settle into the bare branches of an apple tree. He locked the door and walked down the lane with his suitcase. The book ended there, as Cécile Boucher had ended it, without any further sentence. The walk down the lane was the end. I translated the last paragraphs in the first week of February with great care, and then I sat at my desk for a long while and did not type. I had finished a book. The book had moved me. It was complete. I sat for a long while with my hands in my lap, watching the small specks of dust drift in the pale February sun that came in through the study window. I sent the translation off the following week. I made a clean typed copy of the whole thing. I parceled it up with brown paper and string. I took it to Bridget in the post office. She weighed it and stamped it and sent it on its way. She did not ask me what it was, but she could see, I think, that it was a complete thing, and she gave me a small, warm look as she set the parcel in the outgoing pile. "It is a good day to send a thing off," she said. "It is," I said. I had thought, in the days before I sent the manuscript, that I would feel a little adrift afterward. I had thought that I would feel the loss of Henri and the loss of Cécile and the loss of the work. I had been told by other translators in my city days that one always feels a little adrift after sending off a long translation, but I did not feel adrift. I felt, instead, very calm. I walked home from the post office. I made tea. I sat at the round table. I looked out at the harbor. The sea was a soft gray blue. A single boat was moving slowly south. I felt, as I sat there, that I had earned my next thing, whatever it would be. I did not know what it would be. I would let the cottage tell me, as it had told me other things, in its own time. I had begun, in those weeks, to think about a small writing of my own. I had thought, on and off through the winter, that I might begin to write something, not a translation, something that came from me. I had not written anything of my own in a long time. I had not, in fact, written anything of my own since I was a student, and even then I had only written a few short essays for a small student magazine. I had become a translator, and I had been a very contented translator, and I had not felt the need to write anything else, but the notebooks of my aunt had been doing a quiet thing to me. I had been reading them for some months by then. I had finished the first and was halfway through the second. They had begun to suggest to me that there is a kind of writing that is not a story and is not an essay, but is simply a noticing, set down in order, year after year. They had begun to suggest to me that this kind of writing might be a thing one does for oneself, as a kind of company in a quiet place over many years. I had begun to keep my own notebook. I had been writing in the small one I had bought from Bridget on my second day in the village, and which I had brought down with me, and on which I had written, on the first page, Cregmore, Day 1. I have slept very well. I had filled it half full. I bought another. I had begun to write in it almost every evening after supper by the fire. I wrote down the weather. I wrote down what I had cooked. I wrote down what I had seen on my walk. I wrote down a thing Murtaugh had said, or a thing Anne had told me, or a thing Patrick had pointed out from the boat. I wrote down the names of birds I had begun to learn. I wrote down a few lines from a book that had pleased me. I did not write anything ambitious. I did not write anything for anyone. I just wrote down, in the slow, simple way of a small evening attention, the day. It was, I came to think, the way my aunt had written her notebooks. It was the way of a person who has learned to live in a small place, and who knows that the small place will only be small if she chooses to make it so, and who has chosen, instead, to make it as deep as she can. The notebook was a deepening tool. It deepened the day after the day was done. It made the day, in a small way, last. March came in gentler than February. The first signs of spring began. The crocuses came up in a patch under the apple tree, small, pale purple flowers among the bleached grass. The blackbirds began to sing at dawn. The first lambs were born in the fields above the village, and I would meet them sometimes on my walks, small white creatures on wobbly legs with their patient mothers watching me sideways. The sea grew calmer. The boats began to go out farther. The wind shifted again, and the days grew longer, and the sun, when it came out, was beginning to have a faint warmth in it for the first time in months. I had a letter from my publisher. They had received the translation and were very pleased. They had a few small queries which they would send me in due course. They offered me another book, as they had once before, a short novel from the Italian, this time. They wondered whether my Italian was good enough. I wondered too. I wrote back. I told them that my Italian was passable but rusty. I told them that I would take the book on if they were willing to wait while I made it less rusty. They wrote back. They were willing to wait. They would send the book in a few weeks. I had a letter from Joseph Foley in Dublin. He was well. He had finished the first draft of his book on the libraries. He had been to a small exhibition at the National Library, which he described to me in beautiful, careful detail. He hoped I was well. He hoped the cottage was well. He hoped Tess was well. He hoped to come down in May or June if his health permitted. He sent his love. I had a small parcel from a cousin in England whom I had not seen in many years, a Christmas gift sent late. The parcel contained a book of bird drawings and a long, warm letter. The cousin had heard by some chain of family rumor that I had moved to Ireland. She wished me well. She asked whether I would like her to visit. I wrote back. I said I would. The cottage, in March, began to feel a little like a place that had survived a winter. There is a particular tone that an old house takes on in the spring of its first year with a new inhabitant, after a winter in which the two of them have come to an understanding. I had learned the cottage's chimney. The cottage had learned my fire. I had learned the cottage's draughts. The cottage had learned where I kept my mug. I had repaired its small things. It had warmed my small evenings. We had, the cottage and I, established a way of going on together that no one in the village had told us. That was simply ours. On a clear afternoon in late March, I walked out to the lighthouse. The path was firm, the grass on the cliffs was greening, the sea was very blue, and a single sail was making its slow way across the bay. I came up to the lighthouse. Murtaugh was sitting on the bench by the door, in the sun, in his great brown coat. He looked up when I came. "Edmund," he said, "good day to you." "And to you," I said. He patted the bench beside him. I sat down. We sat for a long while in the sun, not speaking. After a time he said, "You have come through the winter, then?" "I have," I said. He nodded. "That is the test," he said. "The winter is the test. If you have come through the winter and you are still here and you are well, then you are settled. I have been thinking about it, and I have decided that you are settled." "I am," I said. "Good," he said. He looked out at the sea. "You should give some thought to a name for your cottage that is your own. Cregmore is the old name. It is a good name. Keep it, but also give the cottage a small private name of your own. It is a thing people do. Your aunt called it, in private, the farmhouse. I do not know why. She told me once, and I have forgotten. Perhaps you will find a small private name for it." "I might," I said. He nodded. He did not press the matter. We sat in the sun a while longer. After a time we rose, slowly, and we went up the iron stair, and we stood in the lantern room and looked out at the wide, bright bay. The view was as good as it had been in October, and different. The light was the spring light now, sharper, cleaner. The sea was a deeper blue. The cliffs were greener. The islands were more visible, less softened by the haze of summer or the murk of winter. I stood beside Murtaugh, and we looked, and we did not speak. The lens of the light shone gently. The sea murmured below. Somewhere far below a gull called. I walked back along the path in the late afternoon. The light was turning gold. The grass was springing under my feet. I came down into the village and walked through it, nodding to people I knew, stopping at the baker's for a small loaf, stopping at the post office for nothing in particular, just to say hello to Bridget. And I climbed up the lane to the cottage. I let myself in. Tess was sitting in the kitchen window. The fire was low but holding. I made it up. I put the kettle on. I sat at the round table with a cup of tea, and I opened my own notebook, and I wrote, "Cregmore, late March. The grass is greening. The crocuses are out. Murtaugh said today that I am settled, and I think he is right. I have come through the winter. I have finished the book. I am here. I am well. I am going to stay." I closed the notebook. I sat for a long while at the round table. The afternoon light moved slowly through the room. The fire ticked. Tess jumped down from the windowsill and came over and sat on my lap. Outside, the sea murmured, and the wind moved softly through the long grass of the garden, and the cottage held its quiet warmth around me. And I sat there, simply sat there, as the day went down, and I knew, with a small private certainty, that I would sit there for many other days and many other years, and that the cottage would hold me, and that I would hold the cottage, and that this was as much as one could ask, and that it was enough. I rose, after a long while, and went to make supper. I made it slowly. I lit the candles. I ate at the round table. I washed up. I sat by the fire. Tess came back to my lap. I read for a while from the second notebook of my aunt's. I read a page about a morning very like my own. When the fire burned low, I banked it. I lit a candle. I went up the narrow stairs, third stair creaking as it always did, and I undressed in the cool spring air of the bedroom. I slid under the patchwork quilt, which was clean and heavy and smelled of lavender. I blew out the candle. I lay on my back and listened. I could hear the sea. I could hear, very softly, the wind. I could hear, somewhere far off in the hills, a single bell. I could hear the small sounds of the cottage settling itself for the night. I could hear my own breath. I closed my eyes. The bed was warm. The dark was deep. The cottage was old and good and kind. I slept. YouTube title: The Quiet House by the Sea. A long, cozy bedtime story for deep sleep. YouTube description: Settle in, close your eyes, and let your mind drift to a small whitewashed cottage on the quiet west coast, where the sea sighs gently against the rocks and a turf fire burns softly in the hearth. In this long, slow bedtime story, Edmund Marsh travels to a tiny seaside village called Cregmore to take up the old cottage left to him by a kind aunt he barely knew. And over the course of an autumn and a winter and the first soft days of spring he finds, in the simplest possible ways, a quieter life. You will share his slow mornings of tea and brown bread by the fire, his rainy afternoons of reading and quiet work, his long walks along the cliffs and down to the harbor, and his gentle evenings with kind neighbors, a wise old lighthouse keeper, and a small white village cat. There are no twists, no dangers, no loud moments, only the sound of the rain on a slate roof, the crackle of turf in the hearth, the long sigh of the sea, the soft kindness of an old village, and a steady, comforting voice to keep you company as you fall asleep. Let the story wash over you slowly. There is no need to follow every word. The story is long, and you do not need to reach the end. Drift, breathe, and rest. The cottage will be waiting whenever you return, designed for deep, restful sleep, gentle nighttime listening, slow evenings, anxiety relief, and quiet companionship.